Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe, it really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight, we journey to the quiet coastal town of Hobe Sound, Florida, where palm trees sway gently in the ocean breeze and small communities know each other by name. It's the kind of place where people move to escape the chaos of bigger cities, where children ride their bikes safely down tree-lined streets, and where neighbors still wave to each other from their front porches. But in April 2016, this peaceful sanctuary would become the backdrop for one of the most disturbing crimes in Martin County's history. Our story centers on Tricia Todd, a 30-year-old woman whose life embodied service and compassion. Tricia wasn't just any resident of Hobe Sound, she was a United States Air Force veteran who had dedicated years of her life to serving her country. After her military service, she found a calling that seemed perfectly suited to her caring nature, working as a hospice nurse, helping families navigate some of the most difficult moments of their lives. Those who knew Tricia described her as someone who possessed an unusual combination of strength and gentleness. Her military background had given her discipline and resilience, while her work in hospice care had deepened her empathy and understanding of human suffering. She was the kind of person who would sit with dying patients when their families couldn't be there, who would hold their hands in their final moments, and who somehow managed to bring comfort to situations that felt utterly hopeless. But perhaps Tricia's most cherished role was that of mother to her 2-year-old daughter, Faith. After 11 years of marriage, Tricia had divorced her husband Stephen Williams, but those who observed their post-divorce relationship noted that it seemed remarkably amicable. This wasn't unusual for Tricia and Stephen, they had known each other since childhood, their lives intertwined long before romance ever entered the picture. Their shared history ran deep through the fabric of their small community. Even after their divorce, Stephen remained actively involved in Faith's life. The former couple had worked out an arrangement that allowed their daughter to maintain close relationships with both parents. Friends and family members later recalled how Tricia seemed committed to making co-parenting work, despite whatever personal challenges had led to the end of their marriage. She wanted Faith to grow up feeling loved and secure, even if her parents were no longer together. The morning of April 26, 2016, began like many others for Tricia. It was a Tuesday, and she had planned to spend the day with Stephen and Faith. In the world of divorced parents, such arrangements often require careful coordination and flexibility, and Tricia had become skilled at navigating these logistics. She had places to go, errands to run, and most importantly, precious time to spend with her daughter. Security cameras at a public supermarket in Hobe Sound captured what would become one of the last confirmed sightings of Tricia Todd alive. The footage shows her moving through the store, going about what appears to be routine shopping. To anyone watching, she would have looked like any other young mother running errands, perhaps picking up supplies for the day ahead, maybe grabbing something special for Faith. The normalcy of the scene makes what followed all the more chilling. After leaving Publix, investigators believe Tricia went to the home where Stephen was staying. This wasn't unusual, their co-parenting arrangement often involved such meetups, and there was nothing to suggest that this particular day would be any different from the many others that had come before. Faith was there, waiting to spend time with both of her parents, blissfully unaware that this ordinary Tuesday would shatter her world forever. But as the hours passed that day, something went terribly wrong. The exact details of what transpired between Tricia and Stephen may never be fully known, but what is certain is that by the end of April 26, Tricia Todd had vanished from the face of the earth. The first sign that something was amiss came the following day, April 27, when Tricia failed to pick up Faith from her babysitter. This was completely out of character for Tricia. As a mother, she was reliable to a fault, especially when it came to matters involving her daughter. The babysitter waited, growing increasingly concerned as the minutes ticked by. Phone calls to Tricia went unanswered, which was equally unusual for someone who stayed in constant communication about her child's welfare. When Tricia's family was contacted about her absence, alarm bells immediately began ringing. They knew their daughter, sister, and friend better than anyone, and disappearing without a word was simply not something Tricia would ever do. She was responsible, communicative, and utterly devoted to Faith. The idea that she would voluntarily abandon her 2-year-old daughter was inconceivable to anyone who truly knew her. Stephen Williams initially appeared to be just as concerned and bewildered as everyone else. When questioned by investigators, he presented himself as a worried ex-husband who was at a complete loss to explain Tricia's disappearance. He told them that he had last seen her on April 26, when she had dropped off Faith at the house where he was staying. According to his account, everything had seemed normal, and he had no idea where she might have gone or why she would disappear. But as investigators began to dig deeper into the circumstances surrounding Tricia's disappearance, they uncovered details that didn't quite add up. Stephen's story, while plausible on the surface, contained inconsistencies that grew more troubling the more they were examined. He claimed that Tricia had asked him for gas money because her fuel was running low, and security footage did indeed show him purchasing gas at around 1 a.m. on the day she went missing. But the timing and circumstances of this transaction raised questions rather than providing answers. The Martin County Sheriff's Office, led by Sheriff William Snyder, launched an extensive search operation. This wasn't just a cursory investigation, it was a comprehensive effort that involved dozens of law enforcement officers, extensive searches of the surrounding area, and countless hours of detective work. The community of Hobe Sound, typically quiet and uneventful, suddenly found itself at the center of a major criminal investigation. As the search continued, investigators began to focus more intently on Stephen Williams. While he continued to maintain his innocence and even agreed to take a polygraph test, his behavior began to strike investigators as increasingly suspicious. There were gaps in his story, inconsistencies in his timeline, and something about his demeanor that didn't quite ring true to seasoned detectives who had interviewed thousands of people over the years. The case took a dramatic turn on May 25, 2016, nearly a month after Tricia's disappearance. It was on this day that Stephen Williams finally broke down and confessed to killing his ex-wife. But even his confession was layered with deception and half-truths that would take much longer to unravel. Initially, Stephen claimed that Tricia's death had been an accident. According to this version of events, he and Tricia had gotten into an argument, and during the heated exchange, he had pushed her. She had fallen, he claimed, and when he checked on her, she appeared to be lifeless. Panicked by what had happened, he said he had moved her body to a location that he couldn't quite remember. This story, while tragic, painted Stephen as someone who had made a terrible mistake in a moment of anger and then compounded it by trying to cover up the accidental death. It was the kind of narrative that, while still criminal, might have garnered some measure of understanding from those who knew the complexities of divorced relationships and co-parenting stress. But investigators weren't satisfied with this explanation. Too many pieces of evidence didn't align with Stephen's account of an accidental death followed by a panicked disposal of the body. Sheriff Snyder and his team continued to press, knowing that Stephen wasn't telling them the complete truth. What emerged over the following months would prove to be far more sinister than anyone could have initially imagined. Through continued questioning and the presentation of mounting evidence, investigators eventually extracted a much more detailed and disturbing confession from Stephen Williams. This wasn't a crime of passion or a tragic accident, it was something far more calculated and horrifying. Stephen eventually admitted that he had planned Tricia's murder in advance. This revelation transformed the case from a possible manslaughter or second-degree murder into something approaching the realm of premeditated homicide. He confessed that on the day of April 26, he had spent hours with Tricia, looking for the right moment to carry out his plan. But throughout that day, he couldn't bring himself to go through with it. He lost his nerve, time and again, as he watched Tricia interact with their daughter and go about her daily routine. But as evening approached, Stephen's resolve apparently hardened. He sent Tricia a text message about their daughter Faith, using the child as a pretext to lure Tricia to a location where he could carry out his murderous plan. The exact content of these messages and the specific details of how he convinced her to come to him remain part of the investigation record, but what is clear is that Stephen used their shared love for their daughter as a weapon against Tricia. The location Stephen chose for his crime was an Airbnb rental property. This detail adds another layer of premeditation to the case. Stephen had specifically secured a location where he could carry out his plan without witnesses or interruption. The choice of an Airbnb suggests forethought and planning that contradicts any notion of this being a spontaneous act of violence. What happened in that rental property was so brutal that even seasoned law enforcement officers struggled to process the details. Stephen didn't simply kill Tricia, he obliterated her existence in the most literal sense. After murdering her, he used a chainsaw to dismember her body, an act of violence so extreme that it speaks to a level of rage and dehumanization that goes far beyond a typical domestic homicide. But the horror didn't end there. Stephen had prepared for the disposal of Tricia's remains with the same cold calculation he had applied to planning her murder. He had already dug a hole in a remote area and placed a plastic tub filled with acid into that hole. The acid wasn't just intended to hide Tricia's body, it was meant to dissolve it entirely, to erase every trace of her physical existence from the world. When investigators eventually located this burial site, what they found was almost too disturbing to comprehend. The acid had done its work over the months that Tricia's remains lay hidden in the ground. Much of her body had been dissolved away, leaving only fragments and traces that could barely be identified as human remains. Sheriff William Snyder, a law enforcement veteran who had seen countless crime scenes, described this case as among the most brutal he had ever encountered. The methodical nature of Stephen's crime suggests a level of planning and forethought that makes it all the more chilling. He didn't just decide to kill Tricia in a moment of rage, he plotted her murder, prepared for the disposal of her body, and then carried out his plan with calculated precision. The fact that he spent an entire day with her before finally acting speaks to a psychological dynamic that is deeply disturbing to contemplate. Perhaps most tragically, Stephen used their daughter Faith as part of his scheme. The text message that lured Tricia to her death involved their 2-year-old child, meaning that Stephen weaponized the most innocent and pure relationship in Tricia's life, her love for her daughter, to facilitate her murder. This aspect of the crime adds a dimension of betrayal that goes beyond the violation of their former marital bond. The investigation that ultimately led to Stephen's confession and the discovery of Tricia's remains was exhaustive and complex. Detectives interviewed dozens of people, combed through hours of surveillance footage, and followed up on countless leads. The case even involved investigating other potential suspects, including a pastor and a ventriloquist who had some connection to Tricia's life. This wasn't a situation where Stephen was immediately identified as the obvious perpetrator. Investigators had to methodically work through multiple possibilities before the evidence finally pointed conclusively in his direction. One of the most challenging aspects of the case was the absence of Tricia's body during the initial investigation. Without physical evidence of the crime, investigators had to build their case on circumstantial evidence, behavioral analysis, and the inconsistencies in Stephen's story. It wasn't until his confession that they were able to locate Tricia's remains, and even then, the condition of those remains made forensic analysis extremely difficult. The legal proceedings that followed Stephen's confession reveal the complex moral calculations that sometimes emerge in criminal justice cases. Prosecutors were faced with a difficult decision. They could pursue first-degree murder charges and potentially seek the death penalty, but doing so would require proving premeditation in court without the certainty of recovering Tricia's body. Alternatively, they could negotiate a plea deal that would guarantee Stephen's confession and lead them to Tricia's remains. State Attorney Tom Bakidal made the difficult decision to negotiate with Stephen Williams, a choice he described to investigators as making a deal with the devil. In exchange for revealing the location of Trisha's body and providing a detailed confession, Stephen was allowed to plead guilty to second-degree murder rather than facing first-degree murder charges. This plea agreement resulted in a sentence of 35 years in prison, rather than the life sentence or potential death penalty that might have accompanied a first-degree murder conviction. The decision to make this deal was controversial and emotionally wrenching for everyone involved. From a prosecutorial perspective, it guaranteed that Stephen would spend decades in prison and provided closure to Trisha's family by allowing them to recover her remains and lay her to rest. From a moral perspective, it meant that a man who had committed one of the most brutal and premeditated murders in the county's history would not face the maximum possible penalty for his crimes. Trisha's family was consulted about the plea agreement, and they ultimately supported the decision to accept Stephen's deal. For them, the priority was bringing Trisha home and ensuring that her killer faced significant prison time, even if it wasn't the maximum sentence possible. In a display of grace that speaks to their character, family members later stated publicly that they forgave Stephen Williams, though forgiveness didn't mean they believed his sentence was inadequate. The location where Stephen buried Trisha's remains was in an area known as Hungryland, which gave the case its media nickname of the Hungryland homicide. This remote area of Martin County became the site of intensive excavation work as investigators worked to recover what remained of Trisha's body. The process was painstaking and deeply disturbing, as searchers had to sift through soil that had been contaminated with acid and human remains. When divers searched a nearby canal, they recovered the chainsaw that Stephen had used to dismember Trisha's body. This physical evidence corroborated the details of his confession and provided forensic confirmation of the extreme violence he had inflicted on his ex-wife. The recovery of this weapon was both a crucial piece of evidence and a stark reminder of the brutality of the crime. Stephen Williams is currently serving his 35-year sentence in the Florida prison system. Even behind bars, he has continued to find trouble, facing additional charges for contraband violations and other prison infractions. His behavior in custody suggests a pattern of disregard for authority and rules that may have been present throughout his life, though it was hidden from those who knew him in the community. The case had a profound impact on the small community of Hobe Sound. Residents struggled to understand how someone they knew could be capable of such extreme violence. Stephen wasn't a stranger or an outsider, he was someone who had grown up among them, who had married a local woman, and who had been part of their community fabric for years. The revelation that he was capable of such calculated brutality forced many people to confront uncomfortable questions about how well we can truly know the people around us. For Trisha's family, friends, and colleagues, the loss was immeasurable. She had been a caregiver by profession and by nature, someone who devoted her life to helping others through difficult times. The hospice patients she had cared for had lost a compassionate advocate, and the families she had supported had lost someone who understood their pain. Her military service represented a commitment to protecting others, and her work as a hospice nurse represented a dedication to providing comfort in humanity's most vulnerable moments. Faith, who was only 2 years old when her mother was murdered, faces the challenge of growing up without Trisha's presence in her life. The child who was used as a lure to facilitate her mother's murder will have to navigate the complex reality of having a father who is serving decades in prison for killing the person who brought her into the world. The extended family and community have undoubtedly rallied around Faith, but no amount of support can truly replace the loss of a mother's love. The investigation and prosecution of this case required enormous resources and emotional energy from law enforcement officers, prosecutors, and court personnel. Detective Michael Oliver and his colleagues had to interview Stephen Williams multiple times, carefully extracting details of the crime that were deeply disturbing to hear. The process of getting Stephen to reveal the full truth about what he had done required patience, skill, and the emotional resilience to engage with someone who had committed such a horrific act. The media attention surrounding the case was intense, with coverage from local news outlets, national networks, and true crime programs. ABC's 2020 featured the case in an episode titled, The Hungryland Homicide, bringing national attention to Trisha's story and the investigation that brought her killer to justice. Investigation Discovery and other true crime networks also featured the case, ensuring that Trisha's story would be remembered and that the details of the investigation would be preserved. This media coverage served multiple purposes. It honored Trisha's memory by telling her story and highlighting the life of service she had led. It provided recognition for the law enforcement officers who had worked tirelessly to solve the case and bring Stephen Williams to justice. And it served as a cautionary tale about the reality that domestic violence can escalate to unimaginable extremes, even in relationships that appear to have ended amicably. The case also highlights the challenges that law enforcement faces in investigating crimes where the victim's body has been concealed or destroyed. Without Trisha's remains, investigators had to rely on behavioral analysis, timeline reconstruction, and the gradual accumulation of evidence that contradicted Stephen's initial story. The fact that they were able to secure a confession and ultimately locate Trisha's body speaks to the skill and persistence of the investigative team. For those who work in domestic violence prevention and intervention, Trisha's case serves as a reminder that the end of a relationship can sometimes be the most dangerous time for victims. Even though Trisha and Stephen appeared to have an amicable post-divorce relationship, the underlying dynamics that led to their divorce may have included elements of control and manipulation that weren't visible to outside observers. Stephen's ability to plan and execute such a calculated murder suggests that he possessed capabilities for deception and violence that he had successfully hidden from those around him. The brutality of the crime also raises questions about the psychology of domestic homicide. Most domestic violence murders, while tragic, don't involve the level of premeditation and extreme violence that characterized Stephen's attack on Trisha. The dismemberment of her body and the use of acid to dissolve her remains suggest a level of rage and dehumanization that goes beyond typical patterns of intimate partner violence. This makes the case particularly disturbing and difficult to understand, even for professionals who work regularly with domestic violence cases. The fact that Stephen used their daughter as a lure to get Trisha to the location where he killed her adds another layer of psychological complexity to the case. This suggests that he was willing to exploit the most sacred bond in Trisha's life, her love for her child, to facilitate her murder. The long-term psychological impact on Faith, when she eventually learns the full details of how her father killed her mother, is difficult to contemplate. The timeline of events also reveals how Stephen was able to maintain his deception for nearly a month after committing the murder. He participated in the search efforts, spoke with investigators, and maintained the pretense of being a concerned ex-husband looking for his missing former wife. This ability to compartmentalize his actions and present a false front to investigators and the community suggests a level of psychological sophistication that makes his eventual confession all the more significant. The physical evidence in the case, while limited due to Stephen's attempts to destroy Trisha's body, ultimately corroborated the details of his confession. The recovery of the chainsaw from the canal, the discovery of the burial site with its acid-filled container, and the forensic analysis of what remained of Trisha's body all supported the account Stephen eventually provided to investigators. The case serves as an example of how modern investigative techniques can solve complex crimes even in the absence of traditional evidence. Surveillance footage, cell phone records, financial transactions, and behavioral analysis all played roles in building the case against Stephen Williams. The combination of traditional detective work and modern forensic capabilities ultimately led to justice for Trisha Todd. As we reflect on this tragic story, we're reminded of the preciousness of life and the devastating impact that one person's actions can have on an entire community. Trisha Todd was a woman who dedicated her life to serving others, first as an Air Force service member protecting her country, then as a hospice nurse providing comfort to dying patients and their families. She was a loving mother who was trying to navigate the challenges of co-parenting after divorce, working to ensure that her daughter could maintain relationships with both parents. The fact that her life was ended by someone she had loved and trusted, someone with whom she had shared years of marriage and the joy of bringing their daughter into the world, makes her death all the more tragic. Stephen Williams didn't just kill Trisha, he betrayed every bond they had ever shared and destroyed the family structure that Faith needed to grow up feeling secure and loved. But even in the darkness of this story, there are elements of light. The investigators who worked tirelessly to solve the case demonstrated the best of law enforcement, showing dedication and skill in pursuing justice for a victim who could no longer speak for herself. The community members who supported the search efforts and rallied around Trisha's family showed the power of human compassion in the face of tragedy. Trisha's family's decision to publicly forgive Stephen Williams, while still supporting his prosecution and imprisonment, demonstrated a level of grace that speaks to their character and perhaps to values that Trisha herself embodied. Their ability to find peace while still demanding justice shows that healing is possible even after the most devastating losses. As we close this story, we remember Trisha Todd not as a victim, but as a woman who lived a life of service and love. Her work as a hospice nurse meant that she was present for countless families during their most difficult moments, providing comfort and dignity to people in their final hours. Her service in the Air Force represented a commitment to protecting others and serving something larger than herself. And her devotion to her daughter Faith represented the purest form of love that exists in this world. The fact that her life was cut short by someone who should have protected her is a tragedy that reverberates far beyond the boundaries of Hobe Sound, Florida. But the memory of who she was, a caregiver, a veteran, a mother, and a woman who tried to make the world a little bit better through her presence in it, continues to inspire those who knew her story. In the quiet hours of the night, as we process this difficult tale, we can honor Trisha's memory by remembering that even in the darkest of circumstances, there are people working to seek truth and justice. We can find comfort in knowing that her killer was brought to justice and that her remains were eventually recovered so that her family could lay her to rest with dignity. And perhaps most importantly, we can remember that Trisha's legacy lives on in the patients she comforted, the families she supported, the country she served, and most of all, in her daughter Faith, who carries forward the best of her mother's spirit into the future. The story of Trisha Todd reminds us to cherish the people we love, to be vigilant about the warning signs of violence in our communities, and to never take for granted the ordinary moments of safety and peace that make up so much of our daily lives. In a world that can sometimes feel overwhelming in its capacity for darkness, the memory of people like Trisha Todd reminds us why it's worth fighting for light. Please, if this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to the channel, where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe, so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. In the quiet village of DeGraff, Ohio, where the morning mist often settles over cornfields and the pace of life moves with the steady rhythm of small-town America, August 16, 2019 began like any other summer morning. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting long shadows across East Main Street, where modest homes sat peacefully in their orderly rows. But within the walls of 207 East Main Street, a tragedy was about to unfold that would shatter this rural tranquility forever. This is the story of Crystal Caudle, a 36-year-old mother who found herself trapped in an unthinkable nightmare on what should have been just another ordinary Friday morning. It's a story that reminds us that even in the safest seeming places, darkness can lurk behind closed doors, and sometimes the greatest danger comes from those we love most. DeGraff, Ohio is the kind of place where everyone knows their neighbors, where children can still ride their bicycles safely down tree-lined streets, and where the biggest excitement might be the Friday night football game at the local high school. With a population of just over 1,200 people, it sits quietly in Logan County, surrounded by the endless farmland that defines much of rural Ohio. The village got its name from Johannes de Graaf, a Dutch immigrant who settled in the area in the 1800s. For generations, families have called this place home, raising their children in its peaceful embrace, working the land, and finding comfort in the predictable rhythms of small-town life. East Main Street runs through the heart of the village like a quiet artery, lined with modest homes where families have lived for decades, watching their children grow up, graduate, and often move away to seek opportunities in larger cities. It was on this very street, in a simple two-story house with white siding and a small front porch, that Crystal Caudle was trying to build a life for herself and her teenage son, Bryson. The house at 207 East Main Street wasn't much to look at from the outside, just another working-class home in a working-class neighborhood, but it represented everything Crystal was trying to achieve: stability, safety, and a future for her family. 16-year-old Bryson Caudle was, by all accounts, a young man wrestling with demons that few people around him fully understood. The transition from childhood to adulthood is never easy, but for some teenagers, it becomes a battleground where anger, frustration, and confusion wage war against reason and family bonds. Those who knew the family had begun to notice changes in Bryson over the months leading up to that fateful August morning. Teachers at the local high school, neighbors who had watched him grow up, and family friends all began to see signs that the boy they had known was struggling with something deeper than typical teenage rebellion. Bryson was dealing with the complex emotions that come with growing up in a single-parent household, where financial stress is a constant presence and where the absence of a father figure can leave a young man searching for identity and purpose. In small towns across America, this story is repeated countless times, though thankfully, it rarely ends in violence. The relationship between mother and son had become increasingly volatile. Arguments were becoming more frequent and more intense, with neighbors occasionally hearing raised voices from the house on East Main Street. Crystal was trying to maintain discipline and guidance while also working to support them both, a balancing act that was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. Looking back, some would wonder if there had been warning signs that could have predicted what was to come. But hindsight is always clearer than the confusion of living through troubled times, and Crystal, like many parents dealing with difficult teenagers, was probably hoping that this was just a phase that Bryson would eventually outgrow. Crystal Renee Caudle had not had an easy life. At 36, she had already weathered more storms than many people face in a lifetime. Like many single mothers in small-town America, she worked hard to make ends meet, juggling the responsibilities of parenthood with the challenge of providing for her family in an economy that seemed to offer fewer and fewer opportunities for people without college degrees or specialized training. Those who knew Crystal described her as a woman who was doing her best under difficult circumstances. She was trying to be both mother and father to Bryson, a role that had become increasingly challenging as he entered his teenage years. The relationship between them had grown strained, as often happens when adolescent rebellion meets the stress of single parenthood. Crystal worked various jobs over the years, always trying to improve her situation, always hoping that things would get better for her and her son. She dreamed of a future where money wouldn't be such a constant worry, where she could provide Bryson with the opportunities she felt he deserved. But like many parents in similar situations, she found herself caught between the demands of working enough hours to pay the bills and being present enough to guide her teenage son through what were clearly becoming troubled waters. Friends and neighbors would later recall seeing Crystal around town, always polite, always trying to keep up appearances despite whatever struggles she might have been facing behind closed doors. She was the kind of person who would smile and ask about your family even when her own world was falling apart. In small towns like DeGraff, this kind of quiet dignity in the face of hardship is both common and deeply respected. Friday, August 16, 2019 dawned clear and warm in Logan County. It was late summer, and the corn was tall in the fields surrounding DeGraff. School would be starting again soon, and perhaps Crystal was looking forward to the return of routine that the academic year would bring. Maybe she hoped that the structure of school would help settle some of the turmoil that seemed to have taken hold of her home. The morning began like countless others had before. Crystal likely went through her usual routine, perhaps making coffee, preparing for another day of work, another day of trying to keep her small family afloat. But something was different this morning, something that would transform an ordinary Friday into the last day of her life. What exactly happened in those early morning hours inside the house at 207 East Main Street may never be fully understood by those of us who weren't there. We know that an argument began, though the specific words that were exchanged, the particular grievances that were aired, the exact sequence of events that led to violence, these details remain largely between Crystal and her son, and now Crystal can never tell her side of the story. What we do know is that at some point, the verbal confrontation escalated beyond anything that had happened before in their troubled household. Bryson, perhaps pushed past his breaking point by emotions he didn't understand and couldn't control, made a decision that would destroy not just his mother's life, but his own future as well. The attack, when it came, was brutal and prolonged. Crystal was stabbed multiple times, the violence fueled by a rage that seems incomprehensible to those of us trying to understand how a son could turn so viciously against the woman who had given him life. But the stabbing wasn't the end of the assault. Bryson also attacked his mother with a baseball bat, adding blunt force trauma to the sharp devastation of the knife wounds. In those terrible moments when her own son turned against her with deadly intent, Crystal Caudle showed a strength and will to live that speaks to the profound human instinct for survival. Despite suffering multiple stab wounds and being beaten with a baseball bat, she somehow found the strength to escape from her own home, the place where she should have been safest. Bleeding and traumatized, Crystal ran from the house at 207 East Main Street. It was still early morning, probably around 7 o'clock, and the neighborhood was just beginning to wake up. We can only imagine the terror and desperation she felt as she fled the home she had worked so hard to provide for her family, seeking help from neighbors who had probably never imagined they would witness such a scene in their quiet village. Crystal managed to reach a neighbor's house, where the magnitude of what had happened immediately became clear. The neighbor, faced with a woman who had clearly been the victim of a violent assault, didn't hesitate to call 911. In small communities like DeGraff, neighbors look out for each other, and this person's quick action in calling for help represented the best of human nature in response to the worst. The emergency call went out shortly after 7 a.m., bringing law enforcement and medical personnel racing toward East Main Street. But for Crystal, the damage was already too severe. Despite the efforts of the neighbor who tried to help her, despite the quick response of emergency services, despite her own incredible will to live, Crystal Caudle's injuries proved fatal. Logan County Sheriff's deputies arrived to find a scene of violence that was shocking even for experienced law enforcement officers. This wasn't the kind of crime they typically dealt with in rural Ohio, where most calls might involve property disputes, minor thefts, or the occasional domestic disturbance that could be resolved with conversation and cooling-off periods. While Crystal lay dying, her son Bryson had fled from the scene of the crime. This 16-year-old who had just committed the ultimate act of violence against his own mother was now somewhere in Logan County, armed and dangerous. The realization that a violent crime had been committed, and that the perpetrator was still at large, sent ripples of alarm through the small community. Law enforcement immediately launched a manhunt, utilizing resources from multiple agencies to search for the teenager. In rural areas like Logan County, someone intent on avoiding capture has many places to hide. The landscape is dotted with abandoned barns, dense woodlots, and countless places where a person could disappear, at least temporarily. The manhunt represented every parent's nightmare and every community's fear. Here was a young person, barely more than a child himself, who had demonstrated a capacity for extreme violence. No one knew what his mental state might be, whether he might harm himself or others, or what his intentions were now that he had crossed the line into murder. Local schools were placed on alert, residents were warned to be cautious, and the normal rhythm of life in DeGraff was suspended as everyone waited to hear whether the dangerous teenager had been captured. In small communities, news travels fast, and soon everyone knew that something terrible had happened on East Main Street, that Crystal Caudle was dead, and that her own son was responsible. The manhunt didn't last long. Perhaps the enormity of what he had done began to sink in, perhaps the adrenaline that had fueled his violent rage began to wear off, or perhaps he simply realized that there was nowhere to run in a county where everyone knows everyone. Whatever the reason, Bryson Caudle eventually surrendered himself to authorities, bringing an end to the search but beginning a legal process that would determine his fate. Logan County Sheriff's deputies and investigators were faced with a crime scene that was both straightforward in terms of evidence and deeply troubling in terms of its implications. The physical evidence clearly pointed to Bryson as the perpetrator: his mother's blood, the weapons used in the attack, and witness testimony from the neighbor who had tried to help Crystal all painted a clear picture of what had happened. But understanding the why behind the crime proved more challenging. What could drive a 16-year-old to murder his own mother with such violence? Investigators had to piece together not just the events of that morning, but the history of the relationship between mother and son, the stresses that had been building in their household, and the mental state of a teenager who had committed an almost incomprehensible act. Sheriff Randy Dodds, who had served Logan County for years and had seen his share of domestic violence cases, was clearly shaken by this crime. In statements to the media, he acknowledged that this wasn't just another case for his department, it was a tragedy that raised questions about how such violence could occur within a family, and whether anything could have been done to prevent it. The investigation revealed that the Caudle household had been under stress, that there had been ongoing conflicts between mother and son, and that Bryson had been displaying behavioral problems that had escalated over time. But nothing in the evidence suggested that anyone could have predicted the explosive violence that occurred on August 16. Investigators also had to consider the question of premeditation. Had Bryson planned to kill his mother, or was this a crime of passion, an argument that spiraled out of control with deadly results? The evidence seemed to suggest the latter, a domestic dispute that escalated beyond all reasonable bounds, resulting in a moment of violence that destroyed 2 lives forever. The murder of Crystal Caudle sent shockwaves through the small community of DeGraff and the broader Logan County area. In small towns, violent crime, especially matricide, is so rare that it challenges everyone's sense of safety and order. People who had known both Crystal and Bryson struggled to understand how such a tragedy could have occurred among people they considered neighbors and friends. Sheriff Dodds made a statement that would resonate long after the immediate crisis had passed. He said, "I think we are all to blame," acknowledging that perhaps society as a whole had failed both Crystal and Bryson in some way. It was a remarkably honest and introspective response from a law enforcement official, recognizing that while the criminal justice system could address the crime after it occurred, the underlying issues that led to the violence were more complex and systemic. The community had to grapple with difficult questions. Should there have been more resources available to help troubled families? Were there warning signs that had been missed? Could better mental health services have prevented this tragedy? These are the kinds of questions that don't have easy answers, but they're the questions that communities must ask themselves when confronted with such senseless violence. Local churches organized prayer services for both the victim and the perpetrator, recognizing that in crimes like this, there are often no real winners, only different degrees of loss. Crystal was dead, but Bryson's life was effectively over as well, his future derailed by a moment of violence that could never be undone. School officials, recognizing that many students would be affected by the knowledge that one of their peers had committed such a crime, made counseling services available and worked to address the fears and questions that naturally arise when violence strikes so close to home. The legal system was faced with a complex case involving a juvenile who had committed an adult crime of the most serious nature. Bryson Caudle was initially charged in Logan County Juvenile Court with murder, felonious assault, and domestic violence, but the severity of the crime and the age of the defendant created immediate questions about how the case should be handled. Under Ohio law, juveniles who commit certain serious crimes can be tried as adults, and prosecutors quickly moved to have Bryson's case transferred to adult court. This decision reflected not only the gravity of the crime but also the prosecutor's belief that the adult criminal justice system was better equipped to handle such a serious offense. The process of transferring a juvenile case to adult court involves careful consideration of multiple factors: the nature of the crime, the defendant's prior record, the likelihood of rehabilitation within the juvenile system, and the overall interests of public safety. In Bryson's case, the brutal nature of the murder and the fact that the victim was his own mother weighed heavily in favor of adult prosecution. Defense attorneys were faced with the challenging task of representing a client whose guilt was essentially undeniable. The evidence was overwhelming, and Bryson had been caught shortly after the crime with clear physical evidence linking him to the murder. The defense strategy would have to focus not on proving innocence, but on explaining the circumstances that led to the crime and arguing for the most lenient sentence possible given the facts. The case moved through the legal system with the deliberate pace that characterizes criminal proceedings. There were hearings, motions, and negotiations between prosecutors and defense attorneys, all while Bryson remained in custody, held without bond due to the serious nature of the charges against him. On March 18, 2020, more than 7 months after the murder of his mother, Bryson Caudle appeared in Logan County Common Pleas Court to formally enter his plea. Standing before Judge Kevin Bragg, the 17-year-old, he had celebrated a birthday while in custody, pleaded guilty to the charge of murder. The guilty plea was the result of negotiations between prosecutors and defense attorneys, discussions that likely focused on avoiding the uncertainty of a trial and ensuring that Bryson would face appropriate consequences for his actions. By pleading guilty, he accepted responsibility for his crime and spared the community the ordeal of a lengthy trial that would have required witnesses to relive the traumatic events of that August morning. For family members and friends of Crystal Caudle who were present in the courtroom, the guilty plea represented a measure of justice, but it could never restore what had been lost. No legal proceeding could bring Crystal back, could undo the violence that had taken her life, or could fully explain why such a tragedy had occurred. The plea hearing was also a moment of reckoning for Bryson himself, standing in handcuffs before the judge, forced to confront the full weight of what he had done. At 17, he was still young enough that the complete implications of his actions, spending much of his adult life in prison, might not have fully registered. But the formal admission of guilt marked the end of any possibility that this had all been some terrible mistake or misunderstanding. Judge Bragg, who had overseen many criminal cases during his time on the bench, was faced with one of the most difficult types of cases that courts handle, a young person whose life had been derailed by a moment of violence, leaving behind victims, families, and a community all struggling to understand and heal. The sentencing hearing, when it finally came, represented the formal conclusion of the legal proceedings but by no means the end of the story's impact on all those affected by Crystal Caudle's murder. Bryson faced the possibility of life in prison, a sentence that would effectively mean spending his entire adult life behind bars for a crime he committed as a teenager. In March 2020, Judge Kevin Bragg sentenced Bryson Caudle to 15 years to life in prison for the murder of his mother. The sentence reflected both the severity of the crime and some consideration for Bryson's age at the time of the offense. With the possibility of parole after 15 years, the sentence offered at least the theoretical possibility of eventual release, though parole would be far from guaranteed given the nature of the crime. The sentence meant that Bryson, who was 17 at the time of sentencing, would be at least 32 years old before he could even be considered for parole. His entire young adult life, the years when most people are finishing their education, starting careers, forming relationships, and beginning families, would be spent in the Ohio Department of Corrections. For those who had known Crystal, the sentence provided a measure of justice, but it was the kind of hollow victory that comes with cases like this. No punishment could truly balance the scales when a life had been taken, especially in such a senseless and violent manner. The sentence represented society's response to the crime, but it couldn't heal the wounds that had been opened in the small community of DeGraff. The judge's decision also reflected the complex balance that criminal justice systems must strike in cases involving young defendants who commit serious crimes. There was recognition that Bryson was still a minor when he killed his mother, but there was also acknowledgement that the crime was so severe that it demanded substantial punishment. In the months and years following Crystal Caudle's murder, the small community of DeGraff continued to grapple with the implications of what had happened on East Main Street. The house at 207 East Main Street stood as a quiet reminder of the tragedy, its windows dark, its small front porch empty of the life and activity that had once defined it as a family home. For neighbors who had lived on the street for years, the memory of that August morning lingered. The image of Crystal running to seek help, the sound of sirens breaking the usual morning quiet, the realization that such violence had occurred just doors away from their own homes, these memories became part of the community's collective experience, reminders that even in the safest seeming places, tragedy can strike without warning. The case also prompted broader discussions about domestic violence, mental health resources for troubled youth, and the supports available to single parents struggling with difficult teenagers. While these conversations couldn't bring Crystal back, they represented the community's attempt to find some meaning in the tragedy, some way to prevent similar incidents in the future. Mental health professionals and social workers pointed to the case as an example of how family conflicts can escalate to dangerous levels without adequate intervention and support. They noted that many families deal with similar stresses, financial difficulties, single parenthood, troubled teenagers, but that most don't end in violence, raising questions about what factors might have made the difference in this case. For the criminal justice system, the case represented both a successful prosecution and a sobering reminder of the limitations of legal remedies. While Bryson had been held accountable for his actions and removed from society where he could pose no further threat, the system had been unable to prevent the crime in the first place or to truly address the underlying issues that led to the violence. In the aftermath of any tragic crime, especially one involving family violence, communities and professionals inevitably ask whether anything could have been done to prevent it. The murder of Crystal Caudle raises difficult questions about how society identifies and responds to families in crisis, particularly when teenage children are involved. Warning signs of escalating family conflict are often visible to teachers, neighbors, law enforcement, and social services, but the challenge lies in knowing when intervention is appropriate and what form that intervention should take. Many families experience conflict and stress without violence, making it difficult to predict which situations will escalate to dangerous levels. The case highlights the particular vulnerabilities faced by single parents, especially mothers trying to raise teenage sons without adequate support systems. Crystal was dealing with the complex challenge of maintaining authority and providing guidance to a young man who was physically larger and stronger than she was, a dynamic that can become dangerous when combined with adolescent anger and family stress. Mental health resources for teenagers, particularly in rural areas like Logan County, are often limited. Many families lack access to counseling services, anger management programs, or other interventions that might help troubled youth develop better coping mechanisms for dealing with frustration and conflict. The case also raises questions about the role of the broader community in supporting struggling families. In small towns like DeGraff, neighbors often know when families are having problems, but there's also a cultural reluctance to interfere in what are seen as private family matters. Finding the right balance between respecting family privacy and offering help when it's needed remains a challenge for many communities. Crystal Caudle's murder was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of family violence that affects communities across America. According to national statistics, domestic violence occurs in families of all socioeconomic levels, in all geographic areas, and across all demographic groups, though certain risk factors, including financial stress, social isolation, and substance abuse, can increase the likelihood of violent incidents. The fact that the perpetrator in this case was a minor makes it particularly troubling and relatively rare. While domestic violence by adults against family members is unfortunately common, violence by children against parents, especially resulting in death, represents a small but deeply disturbing subset of family violence cases. Experts who study juvenile crime note that when young people commit violent acts against family members, it often reflects a complex combination of factors: mental health issues, exposure to violence, substance abuse, social stressors, and sometimes underlying neurological or developmental problems that affect impulse control and decision-making abilities. The rural setting of this crime also adds another layer of context. Small communities like DeGraff often have fewer resources for dealing with mental health crises, domestic violence situations, or other family problems. The nearest major city, Columbus, is more than an hour away, and specialized services that might be readily available in urban areas simply don't exist in many rural counties. This geographic isolation can make it more difficult for families in crisis to access help, and it can also contribute to a sense of social isolation that exacerbates existing problems. When you live in a small town where everyone knows everyone, there can be additional pressure to maintain appearances and avoid seeking help that might be seen as admitting failure. The tragedy that befell Crystal Caudle and her son Bryson offers several important lessons for society as we work to prevent similar incidents. First, it highlights the critical importance of accessible mental health services for children and teenagers, particularly in rural areas where such services are often limited or non-existent. Early intervention programs that identify and assist troubled youth before their problems escalate to violence could potentially prevent some cases like this one. Schools, in particular, are in a unique position to identify students who are struggling with anger, family conflict, or other issues that might put them at risk for violent behavior. The case also underscores the need for better support systems for single parents, especially those dealing with difficult teenage children. Parenting programs, support groups, and respite services could help reduce the isolation and stress that many single parents experience, potentially preventing some family conflicts from escalating to dangerous levels. Community-based programs that teach conflict resolution skills, anger management, and healthy communication could also play a role in prevention. Teaching young people how to manage their emotions and resolve conflicts without violence is a crucial life skill that could prevent tragedies like this one. Finally, the case highlights the importance of community awareness and willingness to intervene when families appear to be in crisis. While respecting family privacy is important, communities also have a responsibility to look out for their most vulnerable members and to offer help when warning signs are present. As we reflect on the life and death of Crystal Caudle, it's important to remember her not just as a victim of violence, but as a person who was trying her best to build a life for herself and her son in challenging circumstances. She was a mother who loved her child and wanted him to succeed, even as their relationship became increasingly difficult. Crystal's death represents not just the loss of one individual life, but the destruction of all the dreams and hopes she had for her future and for her son's future. She will never see graduations, weddings, or grandchildren. She will never have the chance to repair her relationship with Bryson or to see him mature into the man she hoped he could become. Those who knew Crystal remember her as someone who was always trying to do right by her family, despite the obstacles she faced. She worked hard to provide for Bryson, worried about his future, and struggled with the normal challenges that all parents face in raising teenagers in a complicated world. Her story reminds us that behind every crime statistic is a real person with hopes, dreams, fears, and loved ones. Crystal Caudle was more than just a victim. She was a mother, a daughter, a neighbor, and a member of a community that will always remember the tragedy of her death. The small town of DeGraff continues to carry the memory of what happened on East Main Street, and Crystal's death serves as a reminder of the preciousness of life and the devastating consequences that can result when family conflicts spiral out of control. The murder of Crystal Caudle in DeGraff, Ohio on August 16, 2019, stands as a stark reminder that even in the quietest corners of America, family tensions can explode into unthinkable violence. It's a story that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about domestic conflict, teenage anger, and the sometimes devastating consequences when help doesn't arrive in time. As Bryson Caudle serves his sentence in the Ohio Department of Corrections, he carries the weight of a decision that destroyed not just his mother's life, but his own future as well. At 17, he became both perpetrator and victim of circumstances that spiraled beyond anyone's control on a summer morning when words became violence and violence became murder. The case leaves us with more questions than answers. Could this tragedy have been prevented? What signs were missed? How can communities better support struggling families before crisis points are reached? These are the questions that linger long after the court proceedings have concluded and the news cameras have moved on to other stories. For the residents of DeGraff, life has slowly returned to its normal rhythms, but the memory of Crystal Caudle remains. Her death serves as a somber reminder that behind the peaceful facade of small-town America, real people struggle with real problems, and sometimes those problems overwhelm the systems designed to help. In the end, this is a story about the fragility of family bonds, the consequences of unchecked anger, and the irreversible nature of violence. It's a story that should make us all more aware of the families around us who might be struggling, more willing to offer help when we see warning signs, and more committed to ensuring that no other mother suffers the fate that befell Crystal Caudle on that terrible August morning in Logan County, Ohio. The silence that now fills the house at 207 East Main Street stands as a testament to lives lost and futures destroyed, a quiet monument to the devastating power of a single moment when love turned to violence and a family was destroyed forever. Please, if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe, so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. Tonight, we're traveling back to the golden age of Hollywood, to a time when the silver screen's glamour masked dark secrets behind closed doors. This is the story of a murder that would captivate the nation, involving one of Hollywood's biggest stars, her teenage daughter, and a dangerous man who thought he could control them both. It's the evening of April 4, 1958. The sun is setting over Beverly Hills, California, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns and palatial homes of Tinseltown's elite. In one of these homes, on North Bedford Drive, a drama more shocking than any Hollywood thriller is about to unfold. Our story begins with Lana Turner, one of the most glamorous actresses of her generation. Known for her platinum blonde hair, sultry voice, and magnetic screen presence, Turner had risen from humble beginnings to become one of MGM's biggest stars. She was the epitome of Hollywood glamour, beautiful, wealthy, and desired by millions. But behind the carefully crafted public image lay a woman who had struggled with tumultuous relationships and personal demons. Turner had been married 6 times, each marriage ending in heartbreak or scandal. She had a daughter, Cheryl Crane, from her second marriage to restaurateur Stephen Crane. Cheryl was now 14 years old, a bright but troubled teenager who had witnessed far too much adult drama for someone her age. The constant upheaval in her mother's love life had created a complex relationship between mother and daughter, one marked by both fierce protectiveness and underlying tension. Into this volatile situation walked Johnny Stompanato, a man whose very presence seemed to emanate danger. Stompanato was 32 years old, devastatingly handsome with dark hair and piercing eyes, but his good looks concealed a sinister nature. He was a former Marine who had fallen into Los Angeles's criminal underworld after his military service. More troubling still, he was an associate of Mickey Cohen, one of the most notorious gangsters on the West Coast. Stompanato had a reputation as a violent man with an explosive temper. He had served time in prison for armed robbery and had been suspected in numerous other crimes. But perhaps most dangerous of all was his obsession with beautiful, successful women. He saw them not as partners, but as trophies to be possessed and controlled. Turner and Stompanato had met in 1957, and their relationship had quickly become intense and volatile. Friends later described it as passionate but frightening. Stompanato would shower Turner with gifts and affection one moment, then explode into violent rages the next. He was possessively jealous, monitoring her every move and threatening anyone he perceived as competition for her attention. As their relationship progressed, Stompanato's true nature began to emerge more frequently. He had begun making threats, not just to Turner, but to her career, her friends, and most ominously, to her daughter Cheryl. The teenager had grown to fear and despise this man who had inserted himself into their lives like a cancer. By early 1958, cracks in the relationship were becoming impossible to hide. Turner was beginning to realize that Stompanato wasn't just emotionally abusive, he was genuinely dangerous. He had begun making increasingly specific threats about what he would do if she tried to leave him. He spoke of his connections to Mickey Cohen's organization as if they were a sword hanging over her head. The situation became even more complex when Turner was cast in a new film that would require her to travel to England for several weeks of shooting. Stompanato demanded to accompany her, but Turner refused. She saw this as an opportunity to put some distance between them and perhaps find the courage to end the relationship permanently. When Turner left for England without him, Stompanato's reaction was explosive. He began calling her constantly, sometimes 20 or 30 times a day. The calls were a mixture of pleading, threats, and accusations of infidelity. He would alternate between professing his undying love and promising violence if she didn't return to him immediately. Meanwhile, Cheryl was experiencing a brief respite from the tension that had dominated their household for months. Without Stompanato's menacing presence, she could finally relax in her own home. But this peace was shattered by her mother's phone calls from England, during which Turner would break down crying about Stompanato's threatening behavior. The teenager began to understand that her mother was trapped in something far worse than a bad relationship. This wasn't just a boyfriend who was difficult, this was a dangerous criminal who had made it clear he would not let Turner go willingly. When Turner's work in England was completed, she faced an agonizing decision. She could stay away and risk whatever retaliation Stompanato might unleash from thousands of miles away, or she could return to Los Angeles and confront the situation directly. Ultimately, her love for her daughter and her desire to protect Cheryl made the decision for her. She would return home and find a way to end this nightmare once and for all. Turner's return to Los Angeles in early April 1958 was met with immediate confrontation. Stompanato was waiting for her, and his mood had grown even darker during their separation. He was convinced that Turner had been unfaithful during her time in England, despite the fact that she had been working almost constantly. The arguments began immediately and grew more violent with each passing day. Stompanato's threats became more specific and more frightening. He spoke openly about his ability to hurt Turner, to destroy her career, and most chillingly, to harm Cheryl. He made it clear that he considered the teenager an obstacle to his complete control over Turner, and obstacles, in his world, were meant to be removed. Cheryl, now back in the same house as this dangerous man, lived in constant fear. She had grown several inches during her mother's absence and was no longer the child she had been when the relationship began. She was becoming a young woman, one who understood the gravity of their situation better than her mother perhaps realized. The house on North Bedford Drive, once a sanctuary of Hollywood glamour, had become a prison. Turner was afraid to leave for fear of what Stompanato might do in her absence. Cheryl was afraid to go to school, afraid to sleep, afraid to exist in her own home. The staff members who worked for Turner began to notice the tension and started finding excuses to leave early or avoid the house altogether. April 4, 1958, began like many recent days in the Turner household, with an argument. But this argument would be different. This time, Stompanato's threats reached a new level of specificity and malice. He spoke not just of general violence, but of detailed plans for what he would do to both Turner and her daughter if Turner didn't submit completely to his control. As the day progressed, the argument moved from room to room throughout the house. Neighbors later reported hearing raised voices, though the thick walls of the mansion muffled most of the specific words. What they could hear was the tone, angry, threatening, and increasingly desperate. Turner later testified that Stompanato had become more violent than ever before. He had grabbed her, shaken her, and made explicit threats not just against her life, but against Cheryl's. He spoke of his criminal connections as if they were weapons he could deploy at will. Most terrifyingly of all, he began to describe in detail what he would do to the 14-year-old girl if Turner didn't comply with his every demand. As evening approached, the argument reached a crescendo. Turner and Stompanato were in the master bedroom, their voices carrying through the house despite their attempts at discretion. Cheryl, in her own room, could hear every word. She could hear her mother's sobs, her pleas for Stompanato to calm down, and his increasingly violent threats. What happened next would be debated in courtrooms, discussed in newspapers, and analyzed by true crime enthusiasts for decades to come. But the basic facts were undeniable. A 14-year-old girl heard her mother being threatened with death, heard explicit plans for violence against herself, and made a decision that would change all of their lives forever. According to the testimony that would later emerge, Cheryl Crane could hear the argument escalating beyond anything she had witnessed before. Stompanato wasn't just threatening now, he was describing his plans in graphic detail. He told Turner exactly how he would kill her and how he would deal with Cheryl afterward. The teenager, listening from her bedroom, realized that this wasn't just another fight. This was a man preparing to carry out his threats. What goes through the mind of a 14-year-old in such a moment? Cheryl would later describe a strange sense of calm that came over her, as if she was watching the scene from outside herself. She walked to the kitchen and retrieved a large carving knife, a 10-inch blade that the household staff used for preparing meat. She returned to her bedroom and listened again. The threats were continuing, growing more specific and more immediate. Stompanato was no longer talking about what he might do someday, he was talking about what he was going to do tonight, within the next few minutes. Cheryl made her way to her mother's bedroom door. The argument was so intense that neither adult noticed her approach. She could see Stompanato standing over her mother, his face twisted with rage, his fists clenched. Turner was backed against the wall, tears streaming down her face, seemingly frozen with terror. Later accounts of what happened next vary slightly, but the essential facts remained consistent. Cheryl entered the room with the knife hidden behind her back. Some witnesses suggested she called out to Stompanato, trying to get him to stop threatening her mother. Others claimed she approached silently, determined to end the threat once and for all. What is certain is that Stompanato, upon seeing the teenager, turned his attention to her with deadly intent. According to Cheryl's testimony, he began to advance on her with the same violent rage he had been directing at her mother. He raised his hand as if to strike her, and in that moment, 14-year-old Cheryl Crane thrust the carving knife forward, catching Stompanato in the abdomen. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Stompanato collapsed, the knife still protruding from his body. Turner screamed and rushed to call for help, though it was already too late. The blade had pierced vital organs, and Johnny Stompanato, feared gangster, violent abuser, and would-be killer, was dead on the bedroom floor of a Beverly Hills mansion. Cheryl stood motionless, staring at what she had done. Years later, she would describe feeling not regret, but a strange sense of relief. The threat that had dominated their lives for months was finally over. The man who had made their home a place of fear was no longer a danger to anyone. But as the initial shock wore off, the reality of their situation began to set in. This wasn't just any victim, this was Johnny Stompanato, a man connected to some of the most dangerous criminals in Los Angeles. His death wouldn't just bring police attention, it would bring the attention of Mickey Cohen and his organization. Turner, thinking quickly despite her emotional state, called her attorney before calling the police. She understood that this case would require more than just legal representation, it would require careful management to protect both her daughter and herself from both legal consequences and potential retaliation from Stompanato's criminal associates. When the police arrived, they found a scene that seemed almost surreal. Here was Lana Turner, one of Hollywood's most glamorous stars, covered in blood and sobbing over the body of a known criminal. Her teenage daughter sat nearby, calm and collected, readily admitting to the killing but showing no signs of remorse. The initial police interviews revealed the complex dynamics that had led to this moment. Turner's story of months of threats and abuse began to emerge, painting a picture of a woman trapped in an increasingly dangerous relationship. Cheryl's account was even more disturbing, describing a man who had made explicit threats against a child and had been preparing to carry them out. The investigation into Johnny Stompanato's death revealed layers of complexity that extended far beyond a simple domestic dispute. Police discovered that Stompanato had indeed been planning something sinister for that evening. Among his possessions were items that suggested he had been preparing for violence, not just threats, but actual physical harm. More disturbing still was what investigators learned about Stompanato's background and connections. His association with Mickey Cohen wasn't just casual, he had been actively involved in Cohen's criminal enterprises. The police realized they weren't just investigating a domestic killing, they were dealing with someone who had been part of Los Angeles's most dangerous criminal organization. The investigation also revealed the extent of Stompanato's abuse of Turner and his threats against Cheryl. Friends and associates came forward with stories of witnessing his violent behavior, his possessive jealousy, and his explicit threats against both mother and daughter. A pattern emerged of a man who saw violence as a tool to control those around him. Perhaps most shocking was what investigators discovered about Stompanato's plans for that evening. Evidence suggested that he hadn't just been making idle threats, he had been preparing to carry them out. The police found materials that indicated he had been planning to seriously harm both Turner and her daughter if they didn't submit to his complete control. As the investigation continued, public opinion began to shift. Initially, some had viewed the case as a spoiled Hollywood teenager killing her mother's boyfriend in a fit of rage. But as the true nature of Stompanato's character and intentions became clear, Cheryl began to be seen less as a killer and more as a protector who had acted to save both her own life and her mother's. The coroner's inquest, which would determine whether charges should be filed, became one of the most sensational legal proceedings in Los Angeles history. The courtroom was packed with reporters, photographers, and curious onlookers eager to witness this real-life Hollywood drama unfold. Lana Turner's testimony was perhaps the most dramatic moment of the proceedings. Taking the witness stand in a simple black dress, her famous platinum hair styled conservatively, she painted a picture of months of escalating terror. She described Stompanato's violent outbursts, his threats against her career, and most damning of all, his specific plans for harming her teenage daughter. Turner's testimony revealed the calculated nature of Stompanato's abuse. This wasn't just a man with a temper, this was someone who used fear and intimidation as tools of control. He had threatened to disfigure Turner's face, ending her acting career. He had spoken explicitly about what he would do to Cheryl if Turner tried to leave him. Most chilling of all, he had connections to criminals who could carry out these threats even if something happened to him. Cheryl's testimony was equally compelling, though for different reasons. The 14-year-old spoke calmly and clearly about the events of that night, showing none of the emotional instability one might expect from a child who had just killed a man. Instead, she displayed a maturity and composure that was both impressive and heartbreaking. She described hearing her mother's screams, listening to Stompanato's detailed threats, and making the decision to act. When asked if she regretted her actions, her answer was simple and direct: she had protected her mother and herself from someone who was about to seriously harm them both. The testimony of other witnesses painted an even darker picture of Stompanato's character. Friends of Turner described witnessing his violent behavior, his possessive jealousy, and his obvious criminal connections. Several people testified that they had feared for Turner's safety and had been afraid to intervene because of Stompanato's reputation for violence. Perhaps most damaging to Stompanato's posthumous reputation was testimony about his criminal background. Law enforcement officials testified about his connection to Mickey Cohen's organization, his history of violence, and his apparent willingness to use that violence against anyone who crossed him. As the proceedings continued, it became increasingly clear that this wasn't a case of a teenager committing murder in a fit of rage. Instead, the evidence painted a picture of a child who had acted in defense of both herself and her mother against a genuinely dangerous criminal. The coroner's jury deliberated for less than 20 minutes before returning their verdict: justifiable homicide. Cheryl Crane would face no criminal charges for the death of Johnny Stompanato. The jury had concluded that she had acted in defense of herself and her mother against imminent threat of serious harm or death. The verdict was met with widespread public approval. In an era when domestic violence was rarely discussed openly, the case had shone a light on the reality of abusive relationships and the extreme measures sometimes necessary to escape them. Cheryl was seen not as a killer, but as a brave young woman who had protected her family when the law and society had failed to do so. However, the legal victory didn't end the family's ordeal. Mickey Cohen and his associates were furious about Stompanato's death, not necessarily because they cared about him personally, but because they saw it as an affront to their organization. There were rumors of planned retaliation, forcing Turner to hire bodyguards and increase security at her home. The case also had a profound impact on Turner's career. While some in Hollywood shunned her because of the scandal, others praised her for finally speaking openly about domestic abuse. The trial had revealed the extent of her suffering at Stompanato's hands, generating sympathy from fans who had previously seen her only as a glamorous movie star. The killing of Johnny Stompanato had consequences that extended far beyond that April evening in 1958. For Cheryl Crane, the event marked the end of her childhood in the most dramatic way possible. She had been forced to take an adult action to protect herself and her mother, and the weight of that responsibility would stay with her for the rest of her life. In the months following the trial, Cheryl struggled with the attention and notoriety that came with her actions. She was simultaneously praised as a hero and condemned as a killer, depending on who was discussing the case. The teenage years that should have been spent worrying about school and friends were instead dominated by therapy, legal consultations, and constant media attention. Turner, meanwhile, found herself dealing with the complex emotions that came with being both a victim and the mother of someone who had killed to protect her. While she was grateful for Cheryl's actions and recognized that they had probably saved both their lives, she also struggled with guilt about the situation that had led to such extreme measures being necessary. The case also had broader implications for how domestic violence was understood and discussed in American society. In 1958, terms like domestic abuse and battered woman syndrome didn't exist in common parlance. Women who were victims of intimate partner violence often had few legal protections and little social support. The Turner-Stompanato case helped bring these issues into public consciousness in a way that few other events had done. The criminal underworld also felt the impact of Stompanato's death. Mickey Cohen's organization was suddenly under intense scrutiny from law enforcement, who used the publicity around the case to justify increased pressure on known criminal enterprises. Several of Cohen's associates found themselves facing new investigations and legal challenges in the wake of the scandal. As time passed and the immediate drama of the case faded, observers began to grapple with the deeper questions it raised about justice, self-defense, and the protection of the vulnerable. The case became a touchstone for discussions about domestic violence, the rights of children to protect themselves, and the failure of social institutions to protect those in danger. From a legal perspective, the case established important precedents about self-defense and the protection of others. Cheryl's actions were clearly premeditated. She had time to think about what she was doing and could have chosen other options. But the jury and the legal system recognized that sometimes premeditation is necessary when facing a genuine threat to life and safety. The case also highlighted the complex relationship between law enforcement and domestic violence in the 1950s. Police at the time were often reluctant to intervene in what they saw as private family matters, even when violence was involved. Stompanato's criminal connections had made him even more dangerous, but also more difficult for authorities to handle through conventional legal channels. Critics of the verdict argued that Cheryl could have called police instead of taking matters into her own hands. But supporters pointed out that Stompanato's connections to organized crime made traditional law enforcement response uncertain at best. The police might have arrested him, but his criminal associates could have arranged for his release and retaliation against the family. The psychological aspects of the case were equally complex. Cheryl had witnessed months of escalating abuse and had listened to detailed threats against both herself and her mother. Child psychologists who examined the case noted that she had been living in a state of constant fear and hypervigilance. Her actions on that April evening were the result of trauma, terror, and a desperate need to protect her family. In the years following the trial, both Turner and Cheryl worked to rebuild their lives and move past the trauma of their experience with Stompanato. For Turner, this meant continuing her acting career while also becoming an unexpected advocate for domestic violence awareness. She began speaking more openly about her experience, helping other women recognize the signs of abusive relationships. Turner's career actually benefited in some ways from the trial. The public had seen a different side of the glamorous actress, a vulnerable woman who had been trapped in a dangerous relationship and had needed her teenage daughter to save her. This humanized her in a way that many of her film roles had not, creating a deeper connection with audiences. She also became more selective about her romantic relationships, having learned the hard way about the dangers of becoming involved with controlling and violent men. While she would marry again, she was more cautious and more willing to end relationships that showed warning signs of abuse. Cheryl faced different challenges. As the teenager who had killed to protect her family, she became a symbol of both courage and tragedy. Some saw her as a hero who had done what was necessary to save lives. Others viewed her with suspicion, wondering what kind of child could calmly kill an adult and show no remorse afterward. The psychological impact on Cheryl was profound and long-lasting. She had been forced to take an adult action at age 14, and the weight of that responsibility affected her development and relationships for years to come. She struggled with questions about whether she had done the right thing, whether there had been other options, and what kind of person she had become as a result of her actions. The Stompanato case occurred at a time when American society was beginning to grapple with changing attitudes toward violence, family relationships, and the rights of women and children. The 1950s were often portrayed as a time of domestic tranquility and social conformity, but the case revealed the darker realities that existed behind the facade of suburban prosperity. The trial brought unprecedented attention to the issue of domestic violence, though it would be decades before society developed effective responses to the problem. In 1958, there were no shelters for battered women, no legal protections like restraining orders, and little understanding of the psychological dynamics that keep victims trapped in abusive relationships. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of children in households dominated by domestic violence. Cheryl's situation was extreme, but child psychologists began to recognize that many children were living in similar states of fear and hypervigilance, even if they never had to take such dramatic action to protect themselves. From a legal perspective, the case helped establish precedents for self-defense claims, particularly when the defendant was protecting not just themselves but other family members. The jury's quick verdict suggested broad public support for the right to use violence to protect innocent people from imminent harm, even when that violence was premeditated. The media coverage of the case was also significant, representing one of the first times that domestic violence had been discussed so openly and extensively in mainstream American media. Previous cases involving intimate partner violence had often been dismissed as private family matters, but the celebrity status of those involved and the dramatic nature of the resolution made this case impossible to ignore. The killing of Johnny Stompanato became more than just a sensational Hollywood murder case, it became a watershed moment in American attitudes toward domestic violence and self-defense. The case demonstrated that abuse could happen to anyone, regardless of wealth, fame, or social status, and that sometimes extreme measures were necessary to escape dangerous situations. The legal precedents established by the case would be cited in numerous subsequent cases involving self-defense claims. The recognition that victims of domestic violence might need to act preemptively to protect themselves and their families became an important principle in criminal law, though it would take decades for this understanding to be fully developed and implemented. The case also demonstrated the importance of believing victims of domestic violence and taking their reports of threats and abuse seriously. Turner's experience showed that abusers often escalate their behavior over time, moving from emotional abuse to physical violence to threats of death or serious harm. The failure of social institutions to protect victims in such situations sometimes forced them to protect themselves. For Cheryl Crane, the case defined the rest of her life in ways both positive and negative. She became an advocate for children's rights and domestic violence awareness, using her experience to help others recognize dangerous situations and seek help before reaching the point of desperation that she had experienced. She also struggled with the long-term psychological effects of her actions. While she maintained that she had no regret about protecting her mother and herself, she acknowledged that the experience had changed her fundamentally. She had been forced to confront adult realities at age 14, and that premature loss of innocence affected her relationships and life choices for decades. Looking back more than 60 years later, the killing of Johnny Stompanato represents a complex intersection of celebrity, crime, domestic violence, and justice. The case captured public attention not just because of its Hollywood connections, but because it illuminated important social issues that were rarely discussed so openly. The immediate legal verdict of justifiable homicide was supported by evidence that Stompanato had been planning to seriously harm both Turner and her daughter. But the broader verdict of history has been more nuanced, recognizing both the necessity of Cheryl's actions and the tragedy of a situation that required a child to commit violence to protect her family. The case also serves as a reminder of how far American society has come in its understanding and response to domestic violence. In 1958, Turner and Cheryl had few options for escaping Stompanato's threats other than taking matters into their own hands. Today, while domestic violence remains a serious problem, there are more legal protections, support services, and social awareness than existed in that era. The case remains relevant today as discussions about self-defense, domestic violence, and the protection of vulnerable individuals continue to evolve. The fundamental questions raised by Cheryl's actions: when is violence justified to protect oneself or others, how should society respond to domestic abuse, and what responsibility do we have to protect children from dangerous adults, remain as important today as they were in 1958. In the end, the story of Johnny Stompanato's death is both a specific historical event and a universal story about survival, protection, and the lengths people will go to defend those they love. It's a story about a dangerous man who underestimated the courage of his victims, a mother who found herself unable to protect her child from her own poor choices, and a teenager who was forced to grow up in the most dramatic way possible. The physical evidence of that April evening in 1958 has long since disappeared. The house on North Bedford Drive has changed hands multiple times, its tragic history known only to true crime enthusiasts and Hollywood historians. The knife that ended Stompanato's life was returned to evidence storage and eventually destroyed. The bedroom where the killing occurred has been remodeled beyond recognition. But the story lives on, told and retold in books, documentaries, and late-night conversations about justice, survival, and the price of freedom. It serves as a reminder that behind the glamour of Hollywood's golden age lay real people dealing with real problems, and that sometimes those problems required extraordinary solutions. For those of us listening to this story in the quiet hours of the night, it offers both comfort and caution. Comfort in knowing that even in the most desperate situations, people can find the courage to protect themselves and those they love. Caution in recognizing the signs of dangerous relationships and taking action before situations become so desperate that violence seems like the only option. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you'll think about Cheryl Crane, a 14-year-old girl who faced an impossible situation and made an irreversible choice to protect her family. Her story is one of survival, courage, and the complex nature of justice in a world where sometimes the only protection comes from within. The golden age of Hollywood was filled with stories of glamour and romance, but it was also an era of hidden darkness and unspoken struggles. The murder of Johnny Stompanato revealed both sides of that world, showing us that even in the most privileged circumstances, ordinary people sometimes face extraordinary challenges that require extraordinary courage to overcome. And with that thought, we close another chapter in the endless book of human drama, where the line between victim and protector, between justice and tragedy, is sometimes thinner than we'd like to believe. Sleep well, and remember that most of our own stories, thankfully, will never require such dramatic resolutions. Please, I'm just putting it out there, if you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. In the quiet suburban community of Jupiter, Florida, where palm trees sway gently in the Atlantic breeze and million-dollar homes line pristine streets, a darkness was about to unfold that would shock residents and capture national attention. This is the story of Gretchen Stoughton Anthony, a beloved mother, colleague, and friend whose life was tragically cut short by the very person who had once promised to love and protect her. Gretchen Anthony was born on January 8, 1969, into a world that would witness tremendous change over the next 5 decades. At 51 years old, she embodied the spirit of resilience and optimism that would define her throughout her life. Those who knew Gretchen described her as an extraordinarily positive person, someone who had an innate ability to motivate others and see the bright side even in challenging situations. Living in the affluent Abacoa community of Jupiter, Gretchen had built a life centered around her 12-year-old daughter, who was the absolute light of her world. Their bond was unmistakable to anyone who witnessed their interactions. Gretchen was the kind of mother who never missed a school event, who encouraged her daughter's dreams with unwavering support, and who made their home a sanctuary of love and laughter. Professionally, Gretchen was well respected among her colleagues. Her friend and co-worker Jennifer Rogers would later describe her as not just extremely positive, but as a genuinely motivating presence in their workplace. She was the type of person who remembered birthdays, who offered encouragement during difficult projects, and who somehow made even the most mundane workdays more enjoyable simply by being there. But behind this picture of success and happiness lay a more complicated reality. Gretchen was navigating the challenging waters of a marriage that had begun to fracture. She and her husband, David Ethan Anthony, were living separately, a situation that had become increasingly tense as time wore on. David Ethan Anthony, 44 years old, presented a complex and troubling figure to those who encountered him. On the surface, he could be charming and engaging, particularly in his role as a youth sports coach. He had worked with young athletes, a position that required trust from both children and parents. Yet beneath this veneer lurked something far more sinister. Those who worked closely with David began to notice disturbing patterns in his behavior. He was described as hot and cold by a colleague, someone who left others walking on eggshells, never quite knowing which version of David they would encounter on any given day. This unpredictability was more than just moodiness, it was a window into a mind that was becoming increasingly unstable. The marriage between Gretchen and David had deteriorated to the point where they could no longer share the same living space. Family members had grown concerned about David's behavior, describing him as having issues that made them genuinely fearful for Gretchen's safety. These weren't vague concerns or minor marital disputes, they were serious worries based on observable patterns that suggested David might be capable of harming his estranged wife. By early 2020, David's professional life was also crumbling. He was fired from his coaching position in February, removing one of the few stabilizing influences in his increasingly chaotic world. The dismissal left him isolated, angry, and perhaps most dangerously, with abundant free time to focus on his grievances. The timing of what was about to unfold cannot be understood without considering the broader context of March 2020. The world was grappling with the emergence of COVID-19, a pandemic that was spreading fear and uncertainty across the globe. In Florida, as in the rest of the United States, people were just beginning to understand the severity of the situation. The pandemic created a perfect storm of conditions that would later prove crucial to this case. People were isolating themselves, avoiding contact with others, and relying heavily on text messages and phone calls to maintain connections. The idea of someone being unreachable due to illness was not just plausible, it was becoming commonplace. This was the atmosphere in which David Anthony would attempt to execute what he believed was the perfect crime, using the world's fear and confusion about COVID-19 as cover for an act of unthinkable violence. March 20, 2020, was a Friday that began like any other for Gretchen Anthony. She completed her work for the week, likely looking forward to spending the weekend with her daughter. Her colleagues noticed nothing unusual about her demeanor or behavior. She was her typical positive self, perhaps making plans for the days ahead, unaware that her estranged husband was finalizing plans of his own. David Anthony had been thinking about this moment for some time. The evidence would later suggest that this wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of temporary insanity, but rather a calculated plan that he had been developing as his world continued to collapse around him. As Friday evening turned into the early hours of Saturday morning, David made his final preparations. He dressed in dark clothing, likely to avoid detection in the pre-dawn hours. He knew Gretchen's routines, knew the layout of her home in the Abacoa community, and most importantly, knew that her 12-year-old daughter would be there. In the early morning hours of March 21, 2020, at approximately 6 a.m., David Anthony approached Gretchen's home with the intent to kill. The details of what happened next would emerge through a combination of surveillance footage, physical evidence, and David's own eventual confession. Surveillance cameras that Gretchen had installed for security purposes would become crucial pieces of evidence in the investigation. These cameras, which stored their footage in the cloud, captured David lurking on Gretchen's patio in the pre-dawn darkness. The footage shows a figure moving with purpose, someone who was familiar with the property and confident in their ability to gain entry. What the cameras captured next would haunt investigators and family members for years to come. The footage recorded muffled audio of Gretchen's voice as she desperately attempted to call 911. In her final moments, she tried to summon help, tried to save not just her own life but potentially the life of her daughter who was also in the house. A neighbor later reported hearing a blood-curdling scream at around 6 in the morning, a sound so disturbing that it remained etched in their memory. This scream likely marked the moment when Gretchen Anthony's life was brutally ended by the man who had once promised to love and cherish her. Inside the house, the violence was extensive and disturbing. Police would later find a broken picture frame in Gretchen's bed, with shards of glass scattered around the area where she slept. The scene suggested a struggle, a fight for life that Gretchen ultimately lost. What happened immediately after Gretchen's murder reveals the calculated nature of David's planning. Rather than fleeing in panic or attempting to make the death appear accidental, David began implementing a sophisticated cover-up plan that exploited the world's fear of COVID-19. The first phase of this plan involved removing Gretchen's body from the scene. Surveillance footage from the area would later show David's dark blue Mini Cooper leaving the neighborhood, presumably with Gretchen's remains inside. The location where he ultimately disposed of her body would remain a mystery for nearly 2 years. Back at the house, David worked to clean up the evidence of his crime. Police investigators would later find traces of what appeared to be a soapy substance on the driveway, evidence of David's attempts to wash away blood and other forensic evidence. Inside the house, they discovered a stained towel, another piece of evidence that David had tried to sanitize the scene. But perhaps most chilling was David's treatment of Gretchen's 12-year-old daughter. The child had witnessed something that night, something so traumatic that David felt the need to take her with him when he fled. This wasn't just murder, it was kidnapping of a child who had just lost her mother. With Gretchen's body hidden and the immediate scene cleaned, David began phase 2 of his plan, creating a believable explanation for her disappearance that would buy him time to escape. In March 2020, as COVID-19 dominated headlines and sparked worldwide panic, David found his perfect cover story. Beginning on March 21, the same day he murdered his wife, David started sending text messages from Gretchen's phone. These messages, sent to family members and colleagues, claimed that Gretchen had contracted a severe case of COVID-19 and had been hospitalized. The messages described a rapid deterioration in her condition, painting a picture of someone fighting for their life against the virus. The timing was diabolically perfect. In March 2020, COVID-19 was still largely mysterious to the general public. People were terrified of the virus, unsure of its symptoms or progression. The idea that someone could quickly become critically ill and be placed in isolation was not just believable, it was exactly what everyone feared most. The text messages David sent were crafted to discourage visitors or phone calls. They described Gretchen being in the intensive care unit, potentially facing a medically induced coma, and being kept in strict isolation to prevent the spread of the virus. Anyone who knew Gretchen and wanted to check on her would be told, through these false messages, that contact was impossible due to medical protocols. For several days, this deception worked perfectly. Family members and friends, while worried, accepted the explanation. In the early days of the pandemic, stories of people quickly becoming critically ill were all too common. The fear surrounding COVID-19 made people reluctant to question the story or push for more information. However, David Anthony had made a crucial mistake in his planning. While he had anticipated that people might worry about Gretchen, he had underestimated how well they knew her. Gretchen was not the type of person to suffer in silence or to go days without contacting those closest to her, even when seriously ill. Jennifer Rogers, Gretchen's friend and colleague, was among the first to sense that something was wrong. As someone who worked closely with Gretchen, she knew her patterns of communication. Even if Gretchen were hospitalized, Rogers felt certain she would have found a way to reach out, to let people know she was okay, to check on her daughter. The text messages themselves also began to raise red flags. While they contained information about COVID-19 symptoms and hospital procedures, they lacked Gretchen's distinctive voice and personality. People who knew her well began to notice subtle differences in phrasing and tone that didn't match how Gretchen typically communicated. Most concerning of all was Gretchen's complete silence when it came to direct phone calls. The text messages claimed she was too ill to talk, but for someone as communicative as Gretchen, this extended silence felt unnatural and alarming. Rogers and other concerned colleagues decided to take action. They contacted Gretchen's mother, sharing their concerns and asking if she had heard from her daughter. When Gretchen's mother confirmed that she too had only received the strange text messages, they made the decision to request a wellness check from local police. When Jupiter police officers arrived at Gretchen's home in the Abacoa community for the wellness check, they immediately sensed that something was seriously wrong. The house was empty, but signs of disturbance were evident to the trained eyes of the investigating officers. The broken picture frame and glass shards in Gretchen's bedroom painted a picture of violence rather than illness. The stained towel and traces of cleaning substances suggested someone had attempted to sanitize a crime scene. Most telling of all, Gretchen's car was still in the driveway, making it impossible that she had driven herself to any hospital. As officers processed the scene, they began to piece together a timeline that contradicted the COVID-19 story entirely. The surveillance footage from Gretchen's own security system provided crucial evidence, showing David Anthony lurking around the property in the early morning hours of March 21. The audio captured by these cameras was particularly damning. The sounds of Gretchen's attempts to call for help, combined with the timing of David's presence at the house, painted a clear picture of what had occurred. This wasn't a case of someone falling ill with COVID-19, this was murder. Meanwhile, David Anthony and Gretchen's 12-year-old daughter had vanished. David's dark blue Mini Cooper was nowhere to be found, and attempts to contact him directly were unsuccessful. The realization that he had not only killed Gretchen but had also taken her child sparked an intensive multi-state manhunt. As law enforcement agencies across Florida began searching for David Anthony, he was already hundreds of miles away, driving westward across the country with Gretchen's traumatized daughter. This wasn't a panicked flight. Evidence suggests that David had planned this escape route in advance, possibly as part of his overall strategy. The journey across multiple states with a kidnapped child must have been a nightmare for the 12-year-old girl. Having witnessed the murder of her mother, she was now trapped in a car with her killer, uncertain of her own fate and unable to call for help. The psychological trauma of this experience would be something she would carry for the rest of her life. David's choice to head toward New Mexico suggests he may have had a destination in mind, perhaps a place where he believed he could start over or hide indefinitely. However, maintaining a low profile while traveling with a child who was the subject of an Amber Alert proved increasingly difficult. Law enforcement agencies coordinated their efforts across state lines, sharing information about David's vehicle and the circumstances of the case. The story began to attract national media attention, particularly because of the unusual aspect of using COVID-19 as a cover for murder during the early days of the pandemic. On March 31, 2020, exactly 10 days after he murdered Gretchen Anthony, David Anthony was located and arrested in Las Cruces, New Mexico. The arrest brought an end to a multi-state manhunt and, most importantly, secured the safety of Gretchen's daughter. The arrest itself was likely a relief for David in some ways. The stress of maintaining his lies, caring for a traumatized child, and staying ahead of law enforcement had to have been exhausting. More significantly, perhaps some part of him recognized the impossibility of his situation and the inevitability of being caught. Gretchen's daughter was immediately taken into protective custody and reunited with family members. While she was physically unharmed, the psychological impact of what she had witnessed and experienced would require extensive support and counseling. The resilience of children is remarkable, but recovering from such trauma is a long and difficult process. With David in custody, the focus of the investigation shifted to building a comprehensive case against him and, most urgently, locating Gretchen's remains. David had been careful in disposing of her body, and despite extensive searches in Florida and along his escape route, investigators were unable to find her. The legal case against David Anthony was complicated by the fact that Gretchen's body had not been recovered. While the evidence of murder was overwhelming, prosecutors knew that cases without a body can be challenging to prosecute successfully. The surveillance footage, physical evidence from the crime scene, and the circumstances of David's flight provided a strong foundation, but the location of Gretchen's remains remained a crucial missing piece. As the case moved through the legal system, David's defense team likely advised him that the evidence against him was substantial and that conviction was highly probable. The surveillance footage alone was damning, showing him at the scene during the time of the murder and capturing audio of Gretchen's desperate attempts to call for help. The false text messages about COVID-19 also provided clear evidence of premeditation and an attempt to cover up the crime. The sophisticated nature of this deception demonstrated that David had planned Gretchen's murder in advance, which would potentially elevate the charges he faced. Perhaps most damaging of all was the kidnapping of Gretchen's daughter. Taking a child across state lines during the commission of a violent crime added federal charges to an already serious case and demonstrated a callous disregard for the well-being of an innocent victim. On December 21, 2020, David Anthony made a decision that would finally bring some measure of closure to Gretchen's family. He agreed to plead guilty to charges of second-degree murder and kidnapping in exchange for a plea deal that required him to reveal the location of Gretchen's body. The plea agreement represented a calculated decision by both the prosecution and defense. For prosecutors, it guaranteed convictions on serious charges and, most importantly, promised to finally give Gretchen's family the ability to lay her to rest properly. For David's defense team, it likely represented the best possible outcome given the overwhelming evidence of their client's guilt. The emotional weight of this moment cannot be understated. For nearly 9 months, Gretchen's family had lived with the agonizing uncertainty of not knowing where their loved one's remains were located. The inability to hold a proper funeral, to have a place to visit and grieve, compounded the trauma of her murder. When David Anthony stood before Judge Kirk Volker to formalize his guilty plea, he offered what appeared to be a genuine expression of remorse. Through tears, he stated, "I disgraced my family and brought shame upon my name." While these words could never undo the devastating harm he had caused, they represented an acknowledgement of the magnitude of his crimes. Hours after David Anthony's plea deal was finalized, law enforcement officers traveled to the location he had provided to search for Gretchen's remains. The site was remote and carefully chosen, demonstrating that even in the immediate aftermath of the murder, David had been thinking strategically about concealing his crime. The recovery of Gretchen's remains brought a complex mix of emotions to her family and friends. While the discovery provided closure and the ability to finally lay her to rest, it also served as a stark reminder of the violence she had endured and the calculated nature of David's actions. The condition and location of the remains would provide additional evidence for investigators, potentially revealing more details about how Gretchen died and the steps David took to hide his crime. However, out of respect for her family and the ongoing legal proceedings, many of these details were kept confidential. For Gretchen's 12-year-old daughter, now 13 and trying to rebuild her life, the recovery of her mother's body represented both an ending and a beginning. While she could finally say goodbye properly, the trauma of that night in March 2020 would continue to require professional support and the love of her extended family. On January 14, 2021, David Anthony appeared before Judge Kirk Volker for sentencing. The courtroom was filled with Gretchen's family members, friends, and colleagues, many of whom had requested the opportunity to provide victim impact statements. These statements painted a comprehensive picture of who Gretchen Anthony truly was and the devastating impact her loss had on everyone who knew her. Colleagues spoke of her positive attitude and motivating presence at work. Friends described her loyalty, kindness, and infectious laugh. Family members talked about her devotion to her daughter and the dreams they had shared for the future. The cumulative effect of these statements was powerful, providing Judge Volker with a clear understanding of the magnitude of the loss David's actions had caused. It wasn't just one life that had been destroyed, it was an entire community of people who had been robbed of someone they loved. Judge Volker sentenced David Anthony to 38 years in prison, with credit for the 295 days he had already served since his arrest. At 44 years old, this sentence effectively meant that David would spend the remainder of his productive adult life behind bars, a fitting consequence for the calculated murder of his estranged wife. The sentence also provided some measure of justice for Gretchen's daughter, ensuring that the man who had killed her mother and traumatized her would not be free to harm anyone else. While no legal outcome could restore what had been taken from her, the certainty of David's long imprisonment offered a form of protection and closure. In the months and years following David Anthony's conviction, the case continued to resonate beyond Jupiter, Florida. The story gained national attention, partly because of the unusual aspect of using COVID-19 as a cover for murder, and partly because it highlighted the ongoing crisis of domestic violence in America. Legal experts and criminologists studied the case as an example of how criminals might exploit national emergencies or widespread fears to conceal their crimes. The COVID-19 pandemic created unique conditions that David attempted to manipulate, but ultimately, the fundamental elements of good police work and forensic investigation prevailed. The case also served as a reminder of the importance of trusting instincts when someone's behavior seems out of character. Jennifer Rogers and other colleagues who raised concerns about Gretchen's sudden silence potentially prevented David from maintaining his deception for much longer. Their willingness to speak up and request a wellness check was crucial in uncovering the truth. For law enforcement, the case demonstrated the value of modern surveillance technology in solving crimes. The cloud-based security cameras that Gretchen had installed for her protection ultimately provided the evidence that convicted her killer. In an age where privacy concerns often clash with security needs, this case showed how personal surveillance systems can serve justice. The murder of Gretchen Anthony offers several sobering lessons about domestic violence, criminal psychology, and the vulnerability of even seemingly secure lives. Gretchen appeared to have many protective factors: financial stability, a supportive work environment, family connections, and even security cameras in her home. Yet none of these advantages could protect her from someone who was determined to harm her. The case also highlights the particular danger that domestic violence victims face from estranged partners. Statistics consistently show that the period immediately following separation is when women are at highest risk of being killed by abusive partners. Gretchen's decision to live separately from David, while rational and necessary, may have inadvertently escalated his anger and desperation. David's behavior in the aftermath of the murder demonstrates how domestic abusers often view their victims as possessions rather than independent human beings. His decision to kidnap Gretchen's daughter suggests he believed he had some ownership or control over her family, even after committing murder. This possessive mindset is common among domestic abusers and often escalates when they feel they are losing control. The sophisticated nature of David's cover-up plan also reveals how domestic abusers can be calculating and manipulative rather than simply impulsive. The use of COVID-19 as a cover story required planning, awareness of current events, and an understanding of how fear could be exploited. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was a calculated execution. Jupiter, Florida, and particularly the Abacoa community where Gretchen lived, was forever changed by her murder. Residents who had felt secure in their upscale neighborhood were forced to confront the reality that domestic violence can occur anywhere, regardless of socioeconomic status or apparent stability. The case sparked conversations about recognizing warning signs of domestic abuse and the importance of supporting victims who are trying to leave dangerous relationships. Community organizations reported increased interest in domestic violence prevention programs and resources for victims seeking help. Local schools and youth sports programs were also impacted, as David's former role as a coach raised questions about background checks and oversight of adults working with children. The revelation that someone trusted with young athletes could be capable of such violence prompted reviews of safety protocols and screening procedures. For Gretchen's colleagues and friends, the experience of losing someone they cared about to domestic violence created lasting trauma. Many reported feeling guilty about not recognizing signs of danger or not doing more to help. Support groups and counseling services saw increased demand as people processed their grief and confusion. Perhaps no one was more profoundly affected by these events than Gretchen's daughter, who witnessed her mother's murder and was then kidnapped by the perpetrator. The psychological impact of such trauma on a child cannot be overstated, and her recovery became a priority for everyone who cared about Gretchen's memory. Child psychologists and trauma specialists worked extensively with her to help process what she had experienced and develop coping strategies for the difficult path ahead. The resilience of children in the face of unimaginable circumstances is remarkable, but recovery from such trauma is neither quick nor simple. The extended family and community rallied around her, providing both practical support and emotional stability during the most difficult period of her life. Educational support, counseling services, and simply the presence of caring adults all played crucial roles in her healing process. As she grew older and began to understand more fully what had happened to her mother, new challenges emerged. Adolescence is difficult enough without the added burden of such traumatic memories. However, the foundation of support that surrounded her provided hope for her ability to build a meaningful and happy life despite the tragedy she had endured. The murder of Gretchen Anthony occurred during one of the most challenging and frightening periods in recent American history. The COVID-19 pandemic had created unprecedented levels of fear, isolation, and uncertainty. Many families were struggling with job losses, health concerns, and the stress of lockdowns and social distancing. These conditions created what experts recognized as a perfect storm for domestic violence. Victims found themselves trapped at home with their abusers, isolated from support systems, and facing increased stress and financial pressure. Domestic violence hotlines reported dramatic increases in calls during the early months of the pandemic. David Anthony's exploitation of COVID-19 fears as a cover for murder represented an extreme example of how criminals can exploit societal crises for their own purposes. While most people were coming together to support each other during difficult times, David saw an opportunity to use the pandemic as a weapon in his campaign of violence and deception. The case also highlighted the importance of maintaining social connections even during periods of isolation. The colleagues and friends who noticed something was wrong with Gretchen's sudden silence were able to do so because they knew her well enough to recognize when her behavior was out of character. In a world where digital communication was becoming even more important, the quality of relationships remained crucial for detecting when someone was in danger. While David Anthony's conviction and lengthy prison sentence provided a measure of justice for Gretchen's murder, those who knew and loved her understand that no legal outcome can truly balance the scales. A vibrant, loving, positive woman was gone forever, and her 12-year-old daughter would grow up without her mother's guidance and love. However, the thorough investigation and successful prosecution of the case did provide some comfort to Gretchen's family and friends. The fact that David would spend decades in prison ensured that he could not harm anyone else and that Gretchen's daughter would be safe from any future threat he might pose. The case also served as a testament to the dedication of law enforcement officers and prosecutors who worked tirelessly to uncover the truth and hold David accountable for his crimes. From the initial wellness check that discovered evidence of foul play to the complex multi-state investigation that led to his arrest, the professional work of these individuals ensured that justice was served. For Gretchen's memory, the case became a reminder of the importance of recognizing and responding to domestic violence. Her story, while tragic, potentially helped other victims and their supporters understand the warning signs of dangerous relationships and the resources available for those seeking help. As we conclude this examination of the murder of Gretchen Anthony, we're left with profound questions about human nature, the capacity for evil, and the resilience of those who survive unimaginable trauma. How does someone transform from a youth coach and husband into a calculated killer? What factors contribute to such devastating violence, and how can society better protect potential victims? These questions don't have simple answers, but Gretchen's story provides important insights. The warning signs were present: David's unpredictable behavior, his professional difficulties, and the family's expressed concerns about his potential for violence. However, recognizing these signs and taking effective action to prevent tragedy remains one of society's most challenging problems. The case also demonstrates the crucial importance of community connections and the willingness of people to speak up when something seems wrong. Without the intervention of Gretchen's concerned colleagues, David might have maintained his deception much longer, potentially allowing him to escape justice entirely. Perhaps most importantly, Gretchen's story reminds us that behind every crime statistic is a real person with dreams, relationships, and people who loved them. Gretchen Anthony was a devoted mother, a supportive colleague, and a positive force in her community. Her murder represented not just the loss of one life, but the destruction of all the good she might have accomplished in the years that were stolen from her. As her daughter continues to grow and heal, she carries within her both the trauma of that terrible night in March 2020 and the legacy of her mother's love and strength. The community that rallied around her, the justice system that held her mother's killer accountable, and the memory of Gretchen herself will all play roles in shaping the person she becomes. In the end, while we cannot undo the tragedy that befell Gretchen Anthony, we can honor her memory by learning from her story, supporting survivors of domestic violence, and working to create a society where such senseless acts of violence become increasingly rare. Her life mattered, her death was not in vain if it helps protect others, and her memory serves as a reminder of both the darkness humans are capable of and the light that good people bring to the world. The investigation may be closed, the legal proceedings concluded, and David Anthony locked away for decades to come, but the impact of Gretchen's life and the circumstances of her death continue to ripple outward, touching lives and potentially saving others from similar fates. In that sense, her story becomes not just one of tragedy and loss, but also of hope and the enduring power of human connection to overcome even the darkest circumstances. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight, we journey to the summer of 2004, to the quiet residential neighborhoods of Salt Lake City, Utah, where beneath the surface of what appeared to be a perfect marriage, a web of lies was slowly unraveling. This is the story of Lori Hacking, a woman whose trust in the person closest to her would ultimately cost her everything. In the warmth of July 2004, 27-year-old Lori K. Soares Hacking seemed to have everything going for her. She was a dedicated stockbroker at Wells Fargo, known for her bright smile and unwavering optimism. Her colleagues described her as someone who could light up any room she entered, with her infectious laugh and genuine care for others. Lori had been married to Mark Douglas Hacking for 5 years. They were high school sweethearts who had found their way back to each other after college. Mark was 28, tall and clean-cut, with the kind of earnest demeanor that made people trust him immediately. To those who knew them, they appeared to be living the American dream. The couple lived in a modest apartment in Salt Lake City, but that was about to change. Mark had recently graduated from the University of Utah, and more excitingly, he had been accepted to medical school at the prestigious University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. They were preparing for the move that would launch Mark's medical career and give them both a fresh start on the East Coast. But perhaps most wonderfully of all, Lori was pregnant. About 5 weeks along, she was just beginning to share the happy news with close friends and family. She would often place her hand on her still flat stomach and smile, imagining the future they were building together. That July evening, as the sun set over the Wasatch Mountains, Lori and Mark made a routine stop at a convenience store. Security cameras captured them together, Lori in casual clothes, Mark beside her, both seemingly relaxed and content. It would be the last time anyone would see Lori hacking alive. July 19, 2004, began like any other Monday morning in Salt Lake City. The summer air was already warming as the sun climbed over the mountains, promising another beautiful day in Utah. But in the hacking apartment, something was terribly wrong. At approximately 10:30 in the morning, Mark Hacking called the police. His voice was strained with worry as he reported that his wife was missing. He explained to the dispatcher that Lori had gone for her usual morning jog around Memory Grove Park, something she did regularly to stay in shape. But she hadn't returned home, and this was completely unlike her. Mark's story was straightforward and seemed plausible. He told investigators that he had been at work at a psychiatric hospital where he was employed as an orderly. When he came home for lunch, expecting to find Lori there, the apartment was empty. Her car was in the parking lot, but she was nowhere to be found. Her jogging clothes and sneakers were missing from their usual spot. The Salt Lake City Police Department immediately launched a missing person investigation. They began canvassing Memory Grove Park and the surrounding areas, looking for any sign of Lori. The park was a popular spot for joggers and walkers, with winding paths through trees and along a gentle creek. If something had happened to Lori there, surely someone would have seen or heard something. As the hours passed with no sign of Lori, the police began to take the case more seriously. Mark appeared genuinely distraught, calling friends and family members to ask if they had heard from his wife. He spoke to reporters, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. The image he projected was that of a devoted husband desperate to find his pregnant wife. But even in those early hours, something didn't quite add up. When police asked Mark about Lori's route and routine, his answers seemed vague. He couldn't pinpoint exactly where she usually jogged or how long she typically stayed out. For someone married to a creature of habit, these seemed like details he should have known. Word of Lori's disappearance spread quickly through Salt Lake City. Within 24 hours, hundreds of volunteers had joined the search effort. They combed through Memory Grove Park with flashlights and search dogs, calling Lori's name and hoping for any response. The local media picked up the story, and soon Lori's face was on television screens and newspaper front pages throughout Utah. She was described as 5 feet 4 inches tall, weighing about 120 pounds, with shoulder-length brown hair and hazel eyes. The photos showed a woman with a warm, genuine smile, someone who clearly had a lot to live for. Mark appeared on television multiple times, sometimes with Lori's family members, making emotional pleas for information. He spoke about their plans to move to North Carolina, about the baby they were expecting, about how much he loved his wife and needed her to come home safely. The search expanded beyond Memory Grove Park to include the entire Salt Lake Valley. Volunteers on horseback rode through remote areas, while others searched along highways and in abandoned buildings. The Mormon community, which made up a significant portion of Salt Lake City's population, was particularly active in the search efforts, organizing prayer vigils and coordinating volunteer schedules. But as the days passed, hope began to fade. There were no credible sightings of Lori, no evidence that she had ever actually gone for a jog that morning. The investigation was starting to shift from a missing person case to something much more sinister. 3 days after Lori's disappearance, on July 22, the first major crack in Mark Hacking's story began to show. Douglas Hacking, Mark's father, made a shocking revelation to the press. His son had never been accepted to medical school at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. In fact, Mark had never even graduated from the University of Utah. This revelation was like a thunderbolt. For months, Mark had been telling everyone about his acceptance to medical school. The couple had been actively preparing for their move to North Carolina. Lori had already given notice at her job at Wells Fargo. They had been apartment hunting in Chapel Hill and making plans for their new life on the East Coast. As investigators dug deeper into Mark's background, the extent of his deception became clear. Not only had he not been accepted to medical school, but he had also been living an elaborate lie for years. He had been pretending to attend the University of Utah while actually doing nothing. He had fake transcripts, fake textbooks stored in their garage, and had even asked Lori to help him with fictional term papers. The lies were incredibly detailed and sophisticated. Mark had gone so far as to send out graduation announcements to friends and family members, complete with fake ceremony details. He had researched medical school programs extensively so he could speak knowledgeably about his supposed plans. He had even flown to New York City to supposedly interview at Columbia University's medical school, staying with a cousin and putting on an elaborate charade that included wearing a suit and visiting the campus. When investigators interviewed Lori's co-workers at Wells Fargo, they learned something that made Mark's motive crystallize. Several co-workers reported that just days before her disappearance, Lori had seemed troubled. She had been asking questions about the University of North Carolina and had apparently been trying to verify some of Mark's claims about his medical school acceptance. The picture that emerged was devastating. Lori, an intelligent and detail-oriented woman, had apparently begun to suspect that something wasn't right with Mark's story. As someone who worked in finance and was accustomed to verifying information, she would have been naturally inclined to fact-check the details of their impending move. With Mark's lies exposed, the police investigation took on new urgency. If Mark had been deceiving his wife about something as fundamental as his education and career plans, what else might he be hiding? The focus of the investigation shifted from searching for a missing jogger to examining Mark's behavior and whereabouts on the morning of July 19th. Investigators began reconstructing Mark's timeline more carefully. They discovered that his alibi for the morning Lori disappeared wasn't as solid as it had initially seemed. While he claimed to have been at work at the psychiatric hospital, his actual presence there during the crucial morning hours couldn't be definitively confirmed. Meanwhile, the search for Lori continued, but it had taken on a more somber tone. Searchers were no longer looking for a lost jogger who might be found alive. They were looking for evidence of a crime. The focus shifted to areas where a body might have been disposed of, including landfills, remote canyons, and bodies of water throughout the Salt Lake Valley. The psychological pressure on Mark was becoming immense. The lies that had taken years to construct were crumbling in a matter of days. The man who had seemed so composed and concerned in his early media appearances was beginning to show signs of strain. Friends and family members noticed that he seemed agitated, confused, and increasingly erratic in his behavior. On August 2nd, nearly 2 weeks after Lori's disappearance, Mark Hacking's carefully constructed facade finally collapsed entirely. He was found by his family at a local motel, in what appeared to be a complete psychological breakdown. He was naked, disoriented, and seemed to be suffering from some kind of mental health crisis. Mark was taken to a psychiatric facility for evaluation and treatment. It was during this vulnerable state that the truth finally began to emerge. In conversations with his brothers and other family members, Mark began to admit what had really happened on the morning of July 19th. The confession came in fragments, pieced together from multiple conversations. Mark admitted to his brothers that he had killed Lori. He described how the confrontation had unfolded in their apartment, how his carefully constructed world of lies had finally collided with reality, and how in a moment of panic and rage, he had ended his wife's life and the life of their unborn child. According to his confession, Lori had indeed discovered the truth about his lies. She had been researching the University of North Carolina medical program and had discovered that Mark had never been accepted. When she confronted him that morning, demanding explanations and threatening to expose his deception, Mark felt cornered. In his mind, his entire identity was based on these lies. Without them, he believed he would lose everything: his wife, his family's respect, his place in the community. In a moment that he would later describe as snapping, Mark shot Lori while she slept, using a .22 caliber rifle. The act was both impulsive and calculated, ending the life of the woman who had loved and trusted him completely. What Mark did next revealed a chilling level of calculation. Rather than immediately confessing or calling for help, he methodically disposed of Lori's body. He wrapped her in garbage bags and loaded her into his car. Then, in broad daylight, he drove to a dumpster behind a furniture store and disposed of her body as if she were nothing more than trash. The dumpster's contents were regularly collected and taken to the Salt Lake County landfill, a massive facility that processed thousands of tons of waste every day. By the time Mark finally confessed, Lori's body had been buried under layers of garbage in an area spanning several acres. After disposing of Lori's body, Mark returned to their apartment and began staging the scene to support his missing jogger story. He removed Lori's jogging clothes and shoes from their usual locations to make it appear that she had left for a run. He then went to work, establishing an alibi, before returning home to discover that his wife was missing. For nearly 2 weeks, Mark maintained this deception even as hundreds of volunteers searched for his wife. He appeared on television, spoke to reporters, and comforted Lori's grieving family members, all while knowing exactly where she was and what had happened to her. Based on Mark's confession to his family members, police arrested him on August 9, 2004, charging him with first-degree murder and obstruction of justice. Even with his confession, however, authorities were determined to recover Lori's body to provide closure for her family and to strengthen their case against Mark. The search of the Salt Lake County landfill began in earnest. It was a monumental task, requiring dozens of investigators and volunteers to sift through tons of decomposing garbage in the intense summer heat. The work was physically demanding, emotionally draining, and technically challenging. Investigators had to carefully document every item they examined, preserving potential evidence while searching for human remains. The searchers worked in shifts around the clock, using everything from shovels and rakes to heavy machinery and cadaver dogs. The smell was overwhelming, and the conditions were dangerous, with risks ranging from hazardous chemicals to unstable piles of debris. Yet the volunteers and investigators persevered, driven by their commitment to finding Lori and bringing her killer to justice. For nearly 2 months, the search continued with no success. Some began to wonder if Mark's confession had been accurate, or if Lori's remains had been destroyed or moved beyond recovery. The emotional toll on Lori's family was immense as they waited for news while grieving their daughter's death. On October 1, 2004, at approximately 8:20 in the morning, a searcher's careful work finally paid off. Human remains were discovered in the landfill, buried under layers of garbage and debris. The remains were carefully excavated and transported to the Utah office of the medical examiner for analysis. By that afternoon, dental records had confirmed what everyone hoped and feared: the remains were those of Lori K. Soares Hacking. After nearly 3 months of searching, she had finally been found. The discovery brought a mixture of relief and renewed grief to her family and friends. While they were grateful to finally have her body and to know with certainty what had happened, the confirmation of her death made their loss feel fresh and immediate all over again. The medical examiner's investigation revealed that Lori had died from a gunshot wound to the head, consistent with Mark's confession that he had shot her with a .22 caliber rifle. The examination also confirmed that she had been approximately 5 weeks pregnant at the time of her death, meaning that Mark had not only murdered his wife but had also killed their unborn child. With Lori's body recovered and Mark's confession documented, the legal case moved forward relatively quickly. Faced with overwhelming evidence, including his own admissions to family members and the physical evidence recovered from the landfill, Mark's defense team advised him to accept a plea bargain rather than face a potential death penalty at trial. On April 15, 2005, Mark Hacking pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in exchange for a sentence of 6 years to life in prison. The plea agreement meant he would be eligible for parole after serving 6 years, though there was no guarantee he would be granted parole at that time. During the sentencing hearing on June 6, 2005, the full impact of Mark's actions was laid bare. Lori's family members gave victim impact statements that painted a picture of a vibrant young woman whose life had been cut tragically short. They spoke of their grief, their anger, and their struggle to understand how someone they had trusted and welcomed into their family could have committed such an unthinkable act. Lori's mother, Thelma Soares, spoke directly to Mark during the hearing. With remarkable grace and strength, she told him that while she would never understand his actions, she had found it in her heart to forgive him. She urged him to use his time in prison to reflect on what he had done and to find a way to make peace with his conscience. Mark himself spoke briefly during the sentencing hearing, expressing remorse for his actions and asking for forgiveness from Lori's family. However, his words seemed inadequate in the face of the magnitude of his crime. He was sentenced to 6 years to life in prison and was immediately taken into custody. The murder of Lori Hacking sent shockwaves through Salt Lake City and beyond. It became a cautionary tale about the dangers of deception in relationships and the tragic consequences that can result when lies spiral out of control. The case also highlighted the dedication of law enforcement officers and volunteers who worked tirelessly to find Lori and bring her killer to justice. For Lori's family, the pain of her loss would never fully heal. They had lost not only a beloved daughter and sister but also the grandchild they would never meet. The betrayal by Mark, someone they had considered a son, added another layer of hurt to their grief. In the years following the case, Lori's family established a memorial fund in her honor, supporting causes that were important to her during her lifetime. They also became advocates for other families dealing with missing loved ones, sharing their experience and offering support to those facing similar tragedies. The case also had a lasting impact on the Salt Lake City community. The hundreds of volunteers who participated in the search for Lori demonstrated the power of community solidarity in times of crisis. Their willingness to dedicate countless hours to looking for a woman they had never met spoke to the fundamental human decency that exists even in the face of terrible evil. The Lori Hacking case raises profound questions about the nature of trust in intimate relationships. How well do we really know the people closest to us? What happens when the foundation of a relationship is built on lies? And at what point does deception become so entrenched that violence seems like the only way out? Mark's web of lies about his education and career was not a momentary lapse in judgment or a white lie told to avoid embarrassment. It was a systematic, long-term deception that required constant maintenance and elaboration. He created false documents, manufactured fake experiences, and enlisted unwitting accomplices to support his fabricated identity. The psychological profile that emerged of Mark Hacking was that of someone who was deeply insecure and unable to face reality. Rather than dealing with his failures and limitations honestly, he chose to construct a false persona that he believed would be more acceptable to his wife, family, and community. The tragedy is that Lori seemed to love Mark for who he was, not for what he pretended to be. The case also demonstrates how lies can become a trap. As Mark's deception grew more elaborate over time, the stakes of being discovered grew higher. When Lori began to uncover the truth, Mark faced the collapse of everything he had built. Rather than confessing and facing the consequences of his lies, he chose violence as what seemed to him the only way to preserve his secret. Mark Hacking began serving his sentence at the Utah State Prison, where he would spend the next several years. Prison records show that he generally kept a low profile, participating in educational and therapeutic programs. He reportedly struggled with depression and anxiety, perhaps finally confronting the reality of what he had done and lost. In prison, Mark was forced to live with the truth in a way he never had before. There were no more lies to maintain, no false persona to uphold. He was simply inmate number 46623, serving time for the murder of his wife and unborn child. The elaborate deceptions that had once defined his life were replaced by the stark reality of prison walls and the knowledge that he had destroyed everything that had ever mattered to him. The question of Mark's eventual parole became a source of ongoing concern for Lori's family. While the plea agreement made him eligible for parole after 6 years, they dreaded the possibility of his release. They feared not only for their own safety but also worried about the message that early parole might send about the value of Lori's life. More than 2 decades after Lori's murder, the case continues to resonate with those who remember it. It has been featured in numerous true crime documentaries, books, and television programs, each examining different aspects of the tragedy. Some focus on the investigative techniques used to solve the case, others on the psychological profile of Mark hacking, and still others on the impact on Lori's family and the community. The case has also become a study in how modern relationships can be undermined by deception in the digital age. Mark's ability to maintain his lies for so long was aided by the relatively primitive state of information technology in the early 2000s. In today's world, with social media, online records, and digital communications, it would be much more difficult to maintain such an elaborate deception for years. For law enforcement, the case provided valuable lessons about the importance of thoroughly investigating alibis and background information, even when dealing with seemingly cooperative witnesses. The initial focus on searching for a missing jogger might have continued much longer if investigators hadn't been persistent in verifying Mark's claims about his education and career. As we reach the end of this tragic story, it's important to remember Lori not just as a victim, but as a person who lived a full, if too brief, life. She was someone who brought joy to others, who worked hard at her career, and who was excited about becoming a mother. Her colleagues at Wells Fargo remembered her as someone who was always willing to help others and who approached challenges with optimism and determination. Lori's friends described her as someone who saw the best in people, which perhaps made her vulnerable to Mark's deception but also made her a beloved friend and family member. She was known for her infectious laughter, her loyalty to those she cared about, and her ability to find happiness in simple pleasures. The pregnancy that made her murder even more tragic was a source of great joy for Lori in her final weeks. She had talked excitedly with friends about baby names, nursery decorations, and her hopes for the future. The child she was carrying represented not just her own dreams of motherhood, but the continuation of her family's legacy. Even with Mark's confession and conviction, questions linger about the Lori hacking case. Could the tragedy have been prevented if someone had discovered Mark's lies earlier? Were there warning signs that friends and family missed? How many other people might be living similar deceptions, and what can be done to prevent such tragedies in the future? Mental health experts who have studied the case point to the importance of recognizing the warning signs of pathological lying and the psychological pressures that can build when deceptions become unsustainable. They emphasize the need for open communication in relationships and the importance of seeking help when feeling overwhelmed by life's challenges. The case also raises questions about societal pressures and expectations. Mark's lies were largely about achievement and success, graduating from college, getting into medical school, having a respectable career. These are the kinds of accomplishments that society values and rewards, and perhaps that pressure contributed to his inability to accept his actual circumstances and limitations. The murder of Lori Hacking remains one of the most tragic and senseless crimes in Salt Lake City's history. It serves as a reminder of how quickly a life built on deception can collapse into violence and tragedy. It also demonstrates the devastating ripple effects of such crimes, not just on the immediate victims but on families, communities, and all those who participate in the search for truth and justice. Perhaps most importantly, the case reminds us of the preciousness of life and the importance of honesty, trust, and open communication in our relationships. Lori Hacking deserved better than the lies and violence that ended her life. She deserved the chance to raise her child, to pursue her dreams, and to grow old surrounded by people who loved her. In remembering her story, we honor not just her memory, but also the memory of the child she was carrying and the future that was stolen from them both. We remember the hundreds of volunteers who searched tirelessly for her, the investigators who refused to give up, and the family members who continue to keep her memory alive through their love and advocacy. The summer of 2004 in Salt Lake City began with hope and promise, a young couple preparing for a new chapter in their lives, expecting their first child, and looking forward to a bright future together. It ended with tragedy, loss, and the harsh realization that the person we trust most can sometimes be the one who poses the greatest danger. As we close this story, we're reminded that behind every true crime case are real people, victims who had hopes and dreams, families who continue to grieve, and communities that struggle to understand how such tragedies can occur. Lori K. Soares' hacking was more than just a headline or a case study. She was a daughter, a wife, an expectant mother, a friend, and a colleague whose life mattered and whose story deserves to be remembered with dignity and respect. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.